Chapter 702. The bleak autumn rain fell naturally. The green trees on either side of Jingdo's streets and alleys had not had time to dye their leaves yellow. They could only helplessly throw down a few fallen leaves to prove the coldness of the autumn rain and the strength of the autumn wind. The rain slowly moistened the earth, but it annoyed the commoners who worked hard to make a living in the marketplace. They didn't like the waves of coldness their bodies felt. The red walls of the palace did not feel anything. They did not know whether it was cold or warm. They only silently and indifferently welcomed the wash of the rain. The rain drenched the majestic royal palace walls, making the bright red color grow darker and darker. It was like a bloodstain that was about to congeal. The deep palace gate was slowly opened with a creaking sound. The newly repaired brass nails on the big wooden gate were shining brightly. More than 100 officials walked out in a line with complicated expressions. Under the lead of the guards of honor, they walked along the imperial road to the depths of the square and lined up on both sides. These were all officials of the Qin court. They were responsible for all the affairs of the people in this country. In such weather and atmosphere, they could only be silent observers. The eunuch of a eunuch cracked his whip 3 times. Somewhere in the corner tower of the royal palace, there was a faint drumming sound. It made a buzzing and trembling sound and struck the hearts of everyone on the royal palace. The court conference had already ended. There was only one matter dealt with in the court conference. It was deciding on the crimes of the previous director of the Overwatch Council, Chun Pingping. Many Qin commoners gradually walked into the streets and alleys around the royal palace. These commoners wore clothes of different colors and carried different smells of nobility and commoners. Summoned by the drumming in the royal palace, they slowly walked toward the square in front of the palace. More and more people gathered. Gradually, they filled the entire expansive square. They were as dense as ants. Before the sky had even brightened, the Jingdo government and various yamens had begun to beat gongs and drums everywhere. They put up notices to inform all of the people of Jingdo of what would happen today. As long as the tip of the knife did not land on their bodies, these commoners were always interested in watching a show, particularly since everyone knew that the official about to be executed by the emperor was the mysterious and unfathomable director of the Overwatch Council, Chun Pingping. All of the commoners' interest grew even stronger. The Overwatch Council's reputation among the Qin people and officialdom was too resounding. Their image was too sinister and terrifying. Not many people had actually seen the old director in the wheelchair. Everyone surrounded the square. They wanted to see if this figure was truly as the legend said, with 3 heads and 6 arms, covered in black fog, and like a demon. Particularly since they knew that this demon of the Overwatch Council was not satisfied with the emperor's punishment and had deranged in the palace to assassinate the wise, martial, and benevolent emperor of the Qin kingdom. All of the people felt an anger from the bottom of their hearts. They wanted to see with their own eyes how this evil person would be burned into a puff of black smoke under the light of imperial power. For decades, the Overwatch Council had always been famous for being mysterious and sinister. Although it had always targeted the officialdom of the Qin kingdom, its actions were ruthless and its methods terrifying. Offending the civil officials meant offending the scholars and officials under heaven, as well as offending the opinions under heaven. Thus, the Overwatch Council's reputation among the people had always been terrible. In the legends of the people, the Overwatch Council was a sinister yamen that ate people without spitting out their bones. It was best at forcing confessions, extorting confessions, and killing people like scything flax. Perhaps the Overwatch Council truly had many methods that could not see the light of day, but how much of Jingdo, the Qin kingdom, and the people under heaven knew? It was nothing more than a rumor. Although a dazzling Serfan Jr. had appeared in the Overwatch Council and slightly diluted some of the Overwatch Council's dark aura, he had only been in charge of council affairs for a short time. It was not enough to change the deeply ingrained impression of the Overwatch Council among the people. After all, there were not many things that the Duke of Dambois, Fan Xian, could change. The admiration and respect the Qing people and scholars had for Fan Xian was mostly concentrated in his personal image that stood in the clouds. Their opinion of the Overwatch Council had not changed much. For the people of Jingdo, the first bureau of the Overwatch Council had a more human atmosphere. However, they still did not have any good feelings toward that square and sinister building. On the contrary, they unconsciously felt a kind of fear. Was the continuation of this fear an unfounded anger? The legendary and terrifying head of darkness, Chun Pingping, was about to die in front of them. All of the people of Jingdo felt a faint glimmer of excitement and agitation. Perhaps this was just an emotion that the people naturally revealed. To be able to see a figure that only existed in legends die tragically in front of them in this life, and to have more topics to talk about after drinking for their boring lives in the future, perhaps it was a good leisure activity. It was just like the spring examination incident a few years ago. At the entrance to the salt market, the heads of the officials of the Ministry of Rights had been chopped off and rolled around on the execution field. They had almost been snatched away by wild dogs. Just this scene filled up the boring hours of countless Jingdo's bitter people and sent down countless cups of murky, low-quality wine. Another example was the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago. It had also happened at the entrance to the salt market. Countless generals who participated in the rebellion had been beheaded there. Blood had dyed half the street red. A few days later, the stench of blood still seeped into the air. There was also the commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Duqing. When he was executed by 1,000 cuts, his cries were wretched. During these 3 years, Zhang Duqing's death had enriched the lives of the people of Jingdo under the accompaniment of countless spittle. However, none of the major events that had happened in Jingdo in recent years could compare to what happened today. The person who died was the director of the Overwatch Council, the Emperor's most loyal dog that everyone knew. However, this dog had gone crazy and was about to be slaughtered. Furthermore, the place of execution was not at the entrance to the salt market or the killing field in front of the Ministry of Justice. It was in the square in front of the royal palace. Since the founding of the Qing Kingdom, there was probably only one official who had been publicly executed in front of the royal palace. The people thought of this excitedly. They couldn't help but feel anger in their hearts. Who knew what treasonous things Chun Pingping had done to die in such a place? It wasn't that no one thought of Sir Fan Jr. because of the Overwatch Council. All of the people watching the execution had unconsciously forgotten this. They had never thought that Sir Fan Jr. had any connection to that old dog. They were just common people. They didn't know the entanglements between the people who ruled this land. Even if there were some clever people, they would probably think in a different direction. The Emperor had just handed the Overwatch Council to Sir Fan Jr. and was about to kill the previous director. Was it to help Sir Fan Jr. purge the past resistance and crimes in the Overwatch Council? Countless people surged into the square in front of the palace. Nervousness, indifference, excitement, and unexplainable sorrow wrapped in countless complicated emotions surrounded the small execution field. The surrounding imperial soldiers and bailiffs from the Jingdo government responsible for maintaining order forcefully blocked the tens of millions of people outside the borders, ensuring the silence of the execution field. The people of the Qing Kingdom couldn't be blamed. They were used to knowing what they could know, giving up on what they could not know, enjoying what they could enjoy, and being angry at what they were allowed to be angry at. If the emperor wanted to kill an official, regardless of whether or not the official truly deserved it, they had already been taught that if an emperor wanted an official to die, then the official had a reason to die. If his crime deserved to die 10,000 times, they would die 10,000 times. The densely packed crowd was like an ocean, rippling on the flat square in front of the majestic royal palace. The area near the palace gates had been emptied. A simple wooden stage had been set up. This was the so-called execution field. Surrounded by the vast sea of people and the majestic royal palace, the execution field looked like a pitiful, lonely boat. It was as if it could sink at any moment in the sea of people or crash into the unshakable rock of the royal palace and shatter into pieces. Following the empty space below the royal palace, a group walked silently and sternly. They passed the hundreds of Qing officials who unconsciously kept their heads down on both sides of the path. Under the curious and nervous gazes of the Jingdo people not far away, they came to the bottom of the small wooden stage. A stretcher was carried out from the prisoner carriage. On the stretcher lay an old man. He was unconscious. No one knew if he was dead or alive. Zhongwei raised his head and glanced at the top of the royal palace walls. The corners of his eyes twitched slightly. Gently waving his hand, the stretcher was lifted onto the wooden stage. Finally seeing the official who was about to be executed today, seeing this legendary old thief in the darkness, the Jingdo people at the very front sighed with satisfaction and immediately became silent. They looked at the unmoving old man and thought to themselves, "Is this person already dead?" 3 eunuchs walked out of the pitch-black royal palace gates. On the table in the hands of the eunuch on the left-hand side were the crimes the court had decided on. The eunuch on the right-hand side held high an incense table. On the table was the emperor's edict to execute Chen Pingping. The eunuch in the middle with an indifferent expression was Eunuch Yao. He did not come empty-handed. Instead, he held a small bottle. Everything on the wooden stage had been prepared. Chen Pingping's thin and weak body, which seemed to have no breath, was placed on the rain-soaked wooden boards. Eunuch Yao walked to his side and crouched down. With the help of the imperial doctor, he fed him a pill. Then, he carefully fed the soup from the bottle into the old man's dry lips. After an indeterminable amount of time, Chen Pingping slowly woke up from his unconsciousness. He had lost too much blood, and his life was about to be extinguished. His face was very pale, and his eyes were muddy and lifeless. He gazed at Eunuch Yao beside him. The cry from the square earlier was the Jingdo commoners watching the execution, finally seeing the raised torture rack and the treacherous official tied to the rack. Their cries exploded like a mountain, ringing out in all directions like a wave. However, this shout quickly turned into silence. The first to fall silent were the people closest to the execution field. Then, whispers and discussions spread from the front to the back. It didn't take long before it became a thunderous discussion. It was unknown if there was a deity in the heavens issuing an order, but everyone in the imperial city became quiet at the same time. The place where tens of thousands of people gathered at the same time became deathly silent. It was so quiet that the people at the very back could hear the rustling sound of the straw rope binding Chen Pingping's body and the wooden stake grinding against each other. Not only were these people shocked, but the imperial army, the officials supervising the execution, the eunuchs in the palace, and a small number of Overwatch Council officials all looked at the old man's body on the torture frame with shock. Tens of thousands of gazes were all on the old man's thighs. There was nothing there. The old director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping, whose dark name was known throughout the world, was a eunuch. There was silence. Tens of thousands of gazes and countless emotions. Some were pity, some were disdain, some were shock, and some were loathing. Yan Bingyun's body finally began to tremble uncontrollably. He lowered his head rigidly. His eyes were bloodshot. He didn't know about the old director's hidden illness and secret. He only felt that those gazes were not only cast toward the old man's thighs on the execution field, but also toward him and all the Overwatch Council officials. This was an indescribable humiliation. He clenched his fists tightly, his fingertips digging deep into his palms. He finally understood why the emperor on the imperial city had to carry out the punishment of death by 1,000 cuts in front of everyone. It turned out that the physical torture had to be accompanied by the mental humiliation. The emperor wanted to announce to the world that in his eyes, this figure who dared to betray him was only a servant and a dog. He could humiliate him however he wanted. He wanted to step on Chen Pingping's dignity and the Overwatch Council's dignity under his feet and under the gazes of tens of thousands of people. Understanding all of this, Yan Bingyun's mind buzzed. He raised his head with unusual strength and met the old man's muddy and powerless gaze on the execution field. He didn't say anything or do anything. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that the expressions of the court officials below the execution field were also very shocked. They probably would never have thought that the old director of the Overwatch Council, they normally revered like an ancestor, was the eunuch they looked down on the most. This was Chun Pingping's heartbreaking matter. This was Chun Pingping's secret. Not many people knew of his identity as a eunuch. Most of them had already died. Later, under the Emperor's boundless favor and the powerful suppression of the Overwatch Council, no one knew of this reality. That was why these officials showed such a shocked expression. But other than shock, a sliver of disdain appeared on their faces. Human emotions were always this strange. Before the court had sentenced him and they had left the palace to watch the execution, these officials still had a solemn expression on their faces. They still maintained a trace of respect and fear towards Chun Pingping, who was about to die. But now, these emotions had all disappeared. Eunuch Yao accepted the scroll from the eunuch beside him and forced himself not to look at the old man on the rack beside him. In a trembling voice, he began to read out the 13 crimes that the court had decided on regarding Chun Pingping. The autumn rain hit the execution field. Eunuch Yao's heart was also incomparably cold. A kind of sorrow that was difficult to suppress began to rise in his heart. However, he had to continue his work. 1. On the 12th day of the 4th month of the 7th year of the Qin calendar, the traitors secretly sent drugs into the palace and caused chaos in the palace. 2. The traitor repeatedly instigated, using seduction to bewitch the emperor and enticing the princes with benefits, causing me and my son to turn against each other. This is a great rebellion. 3. The traitor used the Hanging Temple to have the head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council plot to assassinate me. Afterward, he assassinated Commissioner Fan in Jingdo. 4. The traitor colluded with the rebel Qin Yi, stole military crossbows from the palace treasury, and assassinated the imperial envoy in the valley outside Jingdo. 5. The traitor used assassins to enter the palace and assassinate the 3rd prince. The 13 major crimes were the charges drawn up by several major departments yesterday, but the first 7 were personally written by His Majesty. It was precisely because these crimes of Chun Pingping were read out at the court meeting that the ministers knew that the old director had actually committed so many treacherous and heinous evil deeds. Even the scholars Shu and Hu, who had been prepared to beg for mercy with their lives, couldn't help but shut their mouths with pale expressions. The last 6 crimes have been decided by the 6 departments. They were just crimes of taking land and bullying men and taking women. Compared to the 7 crimes in front, they appeared too common. However, no matter which one of these 13 crimes, it was a road to death. All 13 crimes added together, as Eunuch Yao's voice, forced out by his internal strength, rang out in the square in front of the royal palace and floated into the ears of all the spectators in the autumn wind and rain. The strange silence was immediately broken. Countless buzzing sounds of discussion and angry cursing rose in the sea of people. Originally, there might have been many commoners who had come to watch the execution nervously and with complicated emotions. As these crimes rang out in front of the royal palace, the gazes turned toward Chun Pingping became indifferent. Of course, the emperor was going to execute such a deranged criminal by 1,000 cuts. Kill him. Someone in the crowd took the lead and yelled. Immediately, the crowd became excited. The cries of kill rang through the sky. On the execution field, Chun Pingping's expression was indifferent. The 1,000-year-old ginseng soup had woken him up but could not save his life. It was as if he had seen through everything. There was only calmness in his indifferent and lifeless eyes. The autumn wind and rain were chilling and chilling. His face was pale, and his lips were black. It was as if he could not hear the deafening cries of kill in front of him. He only turned his head with difficulty, as if he wanted to take one last look at the person on the palace walls who had always been victorious and always victorious. As if feeling his thoughts, the wooden frame turned slightly, giving his muddy gaze the opportunity to see the royal palace. On the tall palace walls, the Qing emperor, wearing a black and gold dragon robe, stood alone under the eaves, right in the center. There was no one beside him. The eunuchs and serving girls had all been chased far away. The 3rd prince, who had been forcefully brought here by the edict to watch, was looking at his father's expression from a distance with a pale face. The emperor stood very high and far away. His figure was very small. However, in Chun Pingping's muddy eyes, he was still very clear. The lonely emperor looked indifferently at his old comrade, surrounded by a sea of people on the execution field. There was not a glimmer of emotion in his eyes. However, this kind of indifference was more terrifying than hatred and made one's hair stand on end. Most of the steel balls in his body had been taken out last night. However, the knife wounds on his body were still bleeding and hurting. The blood stained the black and gold dragon robe, but nothing could be seen. The emperor's face was only slightly pale. There was no sign of pain. However, he looked at the wretched-looking old comrade at his feet and had the desire to make him feel even more pain. The emperor nodded gently. The third prince, who was about 100 feet away from him, had his hands on the wall of the palace. His face was pale, and he subconsciously tightened his grip on the wall. After a long time, the third prince called out in a trembling voice, "Execute." This yell forced Li Chengze, a young man who had been cold and ruthless since childhood, to the verge of tears. He knew why his father had him yell this. The yell on the palace walls stopped. Eunuch Yao began to read the last edict. It was the edict the emperor had personally written last night. "I have known you for decades and have entrusted you with many responsibilities. However, you have deeply betrayed my heart. It is very painful, very painful. For all kinds of crimes, the three departments will jointly investigate. Death by 1,000 cuts. I did not hesitate. According to the law, family members over 16 will be beheaded, and those under 15 will be enslaved. Today, the crimes are only limited to you, and the rest will not be questioned." The edict spread clearly through every inch of the royal palace, every drop of rain, every wisp of autumn wind. It was indifferent and resolute. The emperor did not mention the crimes. He only said that his heart had been betrayed and that he did not care about the pain. He did not show mercy outside the law and did not blame the eunuch's family. The deep pain made one's heart palpitate and their emotions dim. These hypocritical words landed in Chun Pingping's ears. He only smiled slightly and allowed the rain to seep into his dry lips. He lowered his head and no longer looked at the emperor on the palace walls. The execution began. The fishing net tightly covered Chun Pingping's thin body. With great difficulty, he used the mesh to protrude the skin and flesh on his torso. A small, specially made knife trembled as it fell down and slowly cut down, separating this piece of flesh from the old man's body. This was a first cut. A mountainous cheer came from below the execution field. The blade of the knife left the mesh. A piece of flesh fell to the ground and was immediately picked up by an official of the Ministry of Justice. Strangely, the wound in the eye of the net was somewhat pale and dry, but not much blood flowed out. It was as if the blood in this thin and weak traitor's body had already flowed out, and his essence blood had long been sacrificed for something. The executioner holding the knife was an old official of the Ministry of Justice. Although he had already drunk 2 jars of strong alcohol, he still could not stop his hands from trembling. He felt that the thin old man under his knife was different from the officials he had encountered before. There was no blood in the other person's body. The other person had no flesh. It was as if there was only a wisp of a ghost in the other person's body. It was so cold that he couldn't help but tremble. The second cut came down. The flesh was separated. A few faint threads of blood flowed on the fishing net. Another wave of cheers sounded. There were still hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of cuts. Chun Pingping closed his eyes tightly. His face was deathly pale, his lips tightly pressed together, and his entire body trembled. It was as if he was enjoying this pain that no human could endure. He suddenly opened his eyes slowly and looked at the executioner in front of him. Panting, he said, "Your technique is a bit lacking." The executioner had never seen such a person in his life. He had already transcended the so-called toughness. There was only indifference to life, to his own life, and to pain. Perhaps there was something in this old man's body that surpassed pain. His hand trembled again, and he almost dropped the knife onto the wooden platform soaked by the autumn rain. another cut, and another cut. Waves of cheers rose and fell. However, these cheers gradually grew smaller and finally returned to silence. All the officials and people watching the execution closed their mouths and looked with complicated emotions at the old man being tortured. There were no wretched howls, no sorrowful wails, no pleas for mercy, no pleas for death, no random curses. The old man on the execution field in the autumn rain was only silent, deathly silent. So everyone in the royal palace was silent, involuntarily silent, deathly silent. Chapter 703. A few days ago, the last remnants of summer heat still lingered on this land. The first autumn rain had not had time to fall. Only in the morning and dusk did the wind, under the dim sun, have a clear sense of autumn. It passed through the hills, forests, and fields and blew. At that time, Fancien did not have much of a melancholy mood. He sat in the long black line of carriages and grew sleepy with the rise and fall of the carriage. This sleep was fake sleep. He only closed his eyes and opened his mind, allowing the two completely different jinshi in his body to quietly nourish and flow through the two circulations of his body. Tianyi Dao's natural jinshi method was channeled into Zhou Tian. It was gentle and pure, and he had to read it. What he truly relied on, that powerful tyrannical jinshi, moved through every part of his body, strengthening his body and hammering his mind. The contents of the little booklet Sigu Jian had given him before he died were also firmly remembered by Fancien. On the way west to the capital, while he continued to temper his cultivation, he also tried to continue following the mysterious instructions in the little booklet. He opened his mind and sensed the yuan-chi fluctuations that might or might not exist in the surrounding air. Perhaps it was because he was tired from the journey, or because there was too much spiritual energy gathered on the shores of the East Sea. Fancien did not make much progress along the way. However, the speed at which he moved his mind and sensed the changes in the outside world increased greatly. There was not a day that he did not meditate and not a moment that he did not cultivate bitterly. This was probably the true reason why Fancien had the strength and status he had today. A gust of wind blew into the curtain of the carriage and made him narrow his eyes slightly. For some reason, his heart trembled slightly and felt a chill. It was as if he felt that something was about to happen in the world, something that was destined to affect him. What could it be? He narrowed his eyes and looked at the dusky mountains outside. Slowly dissipating the jinshi in his body, he pulled his mind back from his surroundings. The Dongi matter had basically been settled. His father had left Tin family village and returned to Danzhou. Jingdo was calm. Chun Pingping, that old cripple, should also be on his way home. Everything was proceeding according to the beautiful path that Fancien hoped for. Why did he have such an ominous feeling? Fancien's delicate and pretty brows furrowed slightly. After leaving Dongi, the only thing that Fancien felt strange was the ambushes of the volunteer armies of the vassal states along the way. Although these hot-blooded people had come to assassinate a powerful official of the Qing kingdom with the intent to die, the defenses around Fancien were too strong. Additionally, the great prince had sent out a group of 1,000 people as guards. After a few days of attacks, the volunteer armies only left behind bodies and hot-blooded people before dispersing. What made Fancien wary was that the route of his return to the capital from Dongi was very secretive. Even if someone found it in Dongi, they would still need to know. If they wanted to, they would have these attacks and needed to set a powerful intelligence network. His heart jumped. He came to a cold conclusion. Someone within the Overwatch Council was sending intelligence reports to the volunteer army of Dongi's vassal countries. This matter had begun after he had set a date to leave Dongi. It looked like there were some powers in Jingdo who wanted to stop him from returning to the capital. More accurately, they only wanted to delay Fancien's return. What would happen in Jingdo? What matter had to do with him that they were determined not to let him return to Jingdo before it was over? Fancien's gaze grew cold. His body also grew cold. Unconsciously, he tightened the thin cloak around his body. There were only two people who could cause problems to appear within the Overwatch Council. One was the Emperor, and the other was Chun Pingping. Only these two people could delay his return to the capital. Without asking, he knew that what happened in Jingdo must have something to do with the Emperor and Chun Pingping. Fan Xian withdrew his gaze from the scenery outside the carriage window. He was silent for a moment. Then, under the pressure of his powerful worry, he made up his mind. To Mu Feng, who was riding beside the carriage, he ordered, "Change the formation. Use the vanguard to open the way. Along the way, don't delay with those people. Use the fastest speed to get back to Yanjing." Mu Feng's heart jumped. He thought to himself that if they forcefully charged all the way back, many people would probably die. The drawback of speed was injuries. He glanced at Sir Fan Jr. and knew that he must have smelled something strange, which was why he was in a hurry to get back to Jingdo. He didn't dare to ask. He quickly gave the order to advance at full speed to the long group returning to the capital. The sound of horse hooves was like thunder, and the sound of carriages was like metal. Just like this, they sped along the main road from Dongyi to the Qin Kingdom. After traveling for less than an hour, the entire group suddenly slowed down. A warning arrow rang out in front of them. These days, the group escorting Sir Fan Jr. was used to ambushes and ambushes everywhere, so it was not very shaken. However, the warning arrow was strange. It only rang out once and then stopped. Immediately after, a loud cry endlessly rang out from the front and back of the group. Safe. The Overwatch Council's cries for safe were short and quick. They were afraid that their colleagues behind them would accidentally injure the messenger. The messenger was too fast. It was so fast that the defense of the entire group could only glance at the token and not do anything else. Safe. When the last cry rang out beside Fan Xian's black carriage, a light gray figure also flew like a bolt of lightning to the side of the carriage. The group of carriages stretched on for a long time. This person's lightness was about the same as the speed at which an Overwatch Council official sent a message. It was truly shocking. As the leader of Fan Xian's personal guards, Mu Feng held the hilt of his knife warily and looked at the travel-worn and haggard Overwatch Council official who had just landed beside the carriage. This official's face looked unfamiliar, so Mu Feng did not dare be careless. However, when he saw the token the official had been holding high in his right hand, his heart jumped. He made no move to stop him from entering the carriage. The Overwatch Council official, whose clothes had been torn beyond recognition, burrowed into Fan Xian's carriage and directly knelt down. In a raspy voice, he said, "Director Chun has returned to the capital. It is unknown whether he is dead or alive." When this official's lightning-like and wind-like figure appeared beside the carriage, Fan Xian's eyes lit up. They grew brighter and brighter. He saw who the official with such swift movements was. It was the one he had missed for many years, the one he had been closest to in the past. Lao Wang. Watching the official enter the carriage, the light in Fan Xian's eyes gradually grew brighter and brighter. He laughed loudly. However, the laughter suddenly stopped because he heard what Wang Qinian said. The light and joy in Fan Xian's eyes quickly froze and became a ball of burning ice. It was terrifyingly cold and terrifyingly hot. Straightforwardly, he asked, "From where? When?" Wang Qinian's chest rose and fell rapidly. As one of the two wings of the Overwatch Council, he had come from not far outside Dazhou, toward the northeast. He had not rested for a long time and was completely relying on the breath in his heart to support his exhausted body. Now that he had finally seen Fan Xian, he was almost unable to hold on. However, he knew that the question Fan Xian was asking concerned when the old director would arrive in Jingdo and how much time Fan Xian had left. Thus, he gave the answer straightforwardly. Fan Xian sat silently in the chair and closed his eyes. He then opened them. He had already calculated the approximate date Chun Pingping would be escorted back to the capital, as well as the time he would need to rush from this place to Yanjing and then back to Jingdo. Would he not make it in time? The ball of cold fire in Fan Xian's eyes grew stronger and stronger. He looked at Wang Qinian kneeling in front of him and didn't say a word. The glimmer of joy from their long separation earlier was covered by a powerful resentment. Fan Xian had personally arranged the guards for Chun Pingping's return. Under the watch of the Overwatch Council, how could they be taken back by the Emperor? Fan Xian had no idea that everything that happened in Dazhou was only because Chun Pingping wanted to return to the capital. He wanted to go back and ask the Emperor a few questions. Time was pressing. It was as if the mountain fire had already reached his eyebrows. With a cold expression, Fan Xian said to Mu Feng by the carriage window, "All troops return to Dongi. Tell the great prince, unless he has a personally written letter from me, never come back." From knowing that Chun Pingping was returning to Jingdou to Fan Xian giving his first order, it had only taken a moment. Fan Xian's first priority was to deal with the problem of this large group. Following that, he had to guard against the great prince, who currently had over 10,000 soldiers in Dongi, to see if there would be any problems. After giving the order, the people below him would be responsible for carrying it out. Fan Xian did not say another word. He took out a bag of clean water from the compartment of the luxurious black carriage and tied it to his waist. He then rose and took a deep breath. The black carriage suddenly disintegrated. The wooden wall in front of it that was not covered in steel was instantly shattered into splinters. A black figure swept out of the carriage like a bolt of black lightning. The tip of his foot pushed off the horse's head. His entire body shot forward diagonally. A tearing sound rang through the air. Fan Xian treasured every minute and second. The tyrannical Jinshi in his body had been raised to its peak. The magic he had just comprehended also helped his body become more like a bird in the air. Using the flow of the air to speed forward, he turned his body into a black shadow. Like a bolt of lightning, the tip of his foot stepped on the heads of the Overwatch Council officials and floated away. In an instant, he was at the very front of the group. This was probably the ultimate speed Fan Xian could display. In midair, he kicked the general the Great Prince had sent off his horse and snatched the best warhorse in the group. Immediately after, his fingers swiped across and a clean steel needle pierced into the neck of the warhorse. With a flick of his finger, he removed the warhorse's mouth and fed it in a Fedra pill. In this short amount of time, the Black Knight's horse-stimulating technique was miraculously demonstrated by him. Standing on the horse, Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. The horse shot out like an arrow and broke away from the main group. In an instant, it became a little black dot on the road. In just a few hours, it disappeared from everyone's sight. Everyone looked at this scene with their mouths agape. While they were shocked by the little duke's powerful cultivation, they were also extremely puzzled. What had happened in front of them that made the little duke so anxious? Mu Feng had received Fan Xian's order, but he did not understand it. Why did they have to return to Dongi? He unconsciously glanced into the carriage. He had already guessed who the unfamiliar official with the highest ranking token of the Qinian unit was. Sir Wang Qinian was a legendary figure in the Overwatch Council. Mu Feng wanted to find out from his mouth what had happened in Jingdou. When he pulled open the wooden plank, he found that Sir Wang Qinian had already used up all his strength and had fainted in the plank. It had only taken 4 days to travel from Dazhou to here. This was already a speed no human could achieve, yet Wang Qinian had done it. Mu Feng looked at this scene with shock and fear. Unconsciously, he raised his head and gazed in the direction Sir Fan Jr. had disappeared. He vaguely guessed that this was probably a relay race. Perhaps this was a race against the god of death. The icy and powerful autumn wind whizzed across Fan Xian's face like knives. The cold fire in his eyes had already faded. In its place was a frightening calm. He knew what he needed and what the old cripple in Jingdou needed. It was time, only time. He could not understand, nor did he need to understand, why everything, which seemed to be developing in a perfect direction, would suddenly take a sharp turn in Dazhou. He only knew that if the old cripple had returned to Jingdou, it must be because of that matter in the past. The old cripple was going to die. Time was still time, only time. It burned Fan Xian's heart like a mountain fire. It washed against his heart like fine sand in an hourglass. Under the stimulation of the medicine, the warhorse's hooves were like clouds. Its breath was like thunder. Under the stimulation of the medicine, it maintained its fastest speed as it galloped along the road through the woods. It pierced through the mountains and broke through the fog. Through the night, it rode a chaotic stream and moon until it reached Yanjing. For the entire night, Fan Xian did not dismount or slow down. Other than the water pouch at his waist to replenish some water for him and the horse, he did not do anything else. It was a long journey. It would take hours to reach Jingdo, so he needed more energy. The sky had just begun to brighten. Yanjing was already in front of him. In just one night, he had rushed back into the Qing kingdom's territory. Fan Xian was already putting his life on the line. His speed was unbelievably fast. Even the volunteer soldiers lying in ambush on the last stretch of road had no way to react. They could only watch the dust on the road as a lone black rider galloped forward bravely. Fan Xian had to treasure every second, so he would not enter Yanjing. Regardless of whether or not Yanjing had received any secret order from the emperor, he would not take this risk. He would not waste any time. The moment the majestic city came into view, he hooked one foot into the stirrup and took out the arrow of command from his clothes. Circulating the jinshi in his palm, he pointed it toward the sky. With a bang, a beautiful firework pierced through the quiet morning outside the majestic city of Yanjing. The faint crescent moon in the distance was overshadowed by this firework. The rising sun in the east did not have the time to chase after this fleeting ray of light. Most of the people in Yanjing were still sleeping soundly. However, this was, after all, an important pass between northern Qi and Dongyi. The soldiers guarding the city reacted quickly. At the first instant, they sounded the warning gongs and drums in the corner tower at the top of the city walls. In an instant, the Qing soldiers on the city walls gathered together. Holding their weapons tightly, they looked at the war horse and the person on it charging toward them. When Fan Xian approached Yanjing, he could clearly see the weapons in the hands of the soldiers on the city walls reflecting the morning light. However, there was not a trace of emotion on his face. His heart did not move at all. He only pulled hard on the reins of the horse and forcefully changed direction as it galloped. Following the direction of Yanjing's old and thick city walls, he headed east. The soldiers on the city walls watched this scene with wide eyes and open mouths. Immediately after, a wave of murderous horse hooves rang out like thunder. The temporary camp outside Yanjing was in a state of restlessness. At the same time Fan Xian turned east, the 500 black armored riders in the camp had already made their preparations to attack. They charged out of the camp and met up with Fan Xian outside Yanjing's east city gate. The 500 black knights were within the Qing kingdom's borders preparing to receive Fan Xian back to the capital. In the early morning, they saw the signal arrow that symbolized the Overwatch Council's most urgent order. In the shortest time possible, they reacted and came to receive Fan Xian. Fan Xian's speed did not decrease. He merged with the black torrent. His figure could no longer be seen. There was only the sweeping power of a dark cloud. Without any orders or words, Fan Xian's figure lightened. He abandoned the war horse that had galloped for an entire night and floated onto the horse of the deputy commander of the Black Knights beside him. The deputy commander had long leaped onto another empty war horse. The changing of horses was completed at high speed. There were no obstructions. The Black Knights' riding skills were unparalleled in the world. The rumors were indeed true. However, the Black Knight soldiers looked at the director's worried and cold expression. No one asked a question. They knew that something big had happened. Thus, they silently and valiantly followed Fan Xian's arrow and charged toward the plains in the east. With a sorrowful cry, the war horse that had accompanied Fan Xian all night foamed at the mouth and fell to the ground, sending up dust. Its forelegs twitched slightly as it died from exhaustion. In just an instant, all 500 Black Knights disappeared from the plains below Yanjing, leaving behind only this war horse and a cloud of dust. The guards on the walls of Yanjing stared dumbfoundedly at the miraculous scene in front of them and couldn't speak for a long time. Of course, they knew the power of the Black Knights. However, after seeing it with their own eyes, they were still shocked speechless. Particularly, who exactly was that lone rider who had come first? When Yinjing Master Wang Zhikuan learned of everything that had happened in the morning, worry appeared in his eyes. He ordered the entire army to be on guard and seal off the Qing Kingdom, northern Qi, and Dongi borders. The Black Knights who had brought him endless confusion and shock. The Duke who had led the Black Knights to charge through the city had long left the boundaries of Yinjing and stepped onto the true path back to the capital. They passed through province after province, encountering and breaking through obstacles along the way. They didn't waste a word with any of the local officials. They treated any of the Qing laws regarding the movement of troops as nonsense. Under Fan Xian's lead, the valiant 500 Black Knights reached Jingdo as quickly as possible. This was already a matter of a few days later. During these few days, the wild charge of the Black Knights had shocked countless officials and commoners. No one knew what kind of legend it would leave in the history of the Qing Kingdom. The Black Knights' thousandly surprise attack was the best in the world. However, in the past, this steel-like force of the netherworld had only charged bravely outside the country for the benefit of the Qing Kingdom and the Emperor. This surprise attack in the 10th year of the Qing calendar was sweeping across the fertile lands of the Qing Kingdom. In the autumn rain, the Li Pavilion outside Jingdo suddenly trembled. A group of riders like Black Iron and Black Clouds whizzed past, kicking up a cloud of dust and leaves. Jingdo was right in front of him. Fan Xian, in the middle of the Black Knights, was already exhausted to the most difficult moment. He had not rested or slept for many days and nights. He had not eaten. He only relied on clean water to support his exhaustion. Only the cold fire in his eyes and heart stimulated the muscles of his body, keeping him from falling. He had to hurry back. He had to stop everything that was about to happen. You have to wait for me. There was a layer of sand on the outside of Fan Xian's black official robes. His face was also covered in dirt. Even his eyelashes were smeared with a layer. His lips were dry, and his eyes were frighteningly bright. The rain the day before had made this group of Black Knights appear unusually wretched. Even with the Black Knight's abilities, there were still people who could not keep up with Fan Xian's speed in this surprise attack through the heart of the Qing Kingdom and fell out of the group. If Fan Xian had not completely exploded out with his powerful cultivation, he would not have been able to support such a terrifying speed. In the rain the day before, there were finally war horses that could not hold out any longer. No matter how much medicine they used, they could not move forward. Fan Xian had changed horses 10 times among the Black Knights and could not find any more. So, he had robbed a merchant group on the road and taken 30 horses. At Fan Xian's side, there were still 20 or so Black Knights. It was such a small group that made the ground outside of Jingdo tremble. It was like there was an irresistible army closing in on the heart of the Qing Kingdom. The Black Knights came to Jingdo and charged straight for Zhengyang Gate. The Jingdo city gates were tightly shut. All of the defensive powers had been raised to the highest level. The soldiers of the 13 city gate guards and the riders of the Jingdo garrison were solemnly watching everything outside Jingdo. However, these dozens of Black Knights had come too quickly and decisively. They were so fast that the Jingdo garrison had no time to react before they arrived at Zhengyang Gate. When they were about 500 feet away from Zhengyang Gate, Fan Xian wiped away the dirty rainwater on his face. His horse did not slow. He shouted at the generals on Zhengyang Gate in a stern voice, "Open the gate! I am Fan Xian." Sir Fan Jr. had returned. The faces of the generals and officials on the city walls all paled. They knew what was happening in front of the royal palace in Jingdo. However, these generals had been ordered to defend the city because the palace was worried about whether or not the Overwatch Council would implicate the other powers in court. No one had thought that Sir Fan Jr. would suddenly appear at Zhengyang Gate in Jingdo. Regardless of whether it was the Qing Emperor, who used coldness to suppress his rage, or Chun Ping, who had done everything he could to stop Fan Xian from returning to the capital, none of them would have thought that Fan Xian would rush back to Jingdo. The last time the Qing court knew of Fan Xian, he was still far outside the country and on his way back to Jingdo from Dongi. Even if he flew, he probably wouldn't be able to make it back in time. However, what no one could believe was that Fan Xian had rushed back. Defend the city gates to the death. Archers, get ready. The commander of Jinyang Gate was the first to react. The order he had received was to close the Jingdo city gates and forbid entry and exit. With a trembling voice, he looked at the 20 or so black knights coming closer and closer. It was like he was looking at an army about to attack the city. With a pale face, he gave the order. Even if Sir Fan Jr. had rushed back, he could not be allowed to enter the capital today, particularly today. Sir Fan Jr., today. The commander of Jinyang Gate wanted to explain something to Fan Xian on his horse, but Fan Xian did not have the time to listen to his explanation. The warhorse beneath him did not slow. His gaze swept across the walls of Jinyang Gate and saw the soldiers waiting in formation. His heart tightened. He knew that even though he had rushed back to Jingdo with all his might, he was still too late. On the horse, Fan Xian's eyes exploded with a cold light. He stared fixedly at the soldiers on the top of the city walls until they all timidly withdrew their gazes. The Black Knights came closer and closer to the city gates. Fan Xian raised his right hand and then chopped down forcefully. The 20 or so Black Knights behind him formed a triangular formation and slowed down, staying out of the range of the archers on the top of the city walls. The hearts of the people on the Jingdo city walls relaxed. Although the 20 or so Black Knights had a threatening aura, these people could not break through the city walls. However, if they actually faced the Black Knights head-on, who knew what would happen in the future? As long as the Black Knights stopped and did not attack forcefully, it would be good. However, Fan Xian did not slow down. He continued to charge in the direction of Jinyang Gate. The 20 or so Black Knights behind him calmly took out the crossbows on their backs. Bang! 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 A concentrated sound rang out. The crossbows suddenly fired and shot grappling hooks toward the top of the city walls. With a clang, they firmly latched onto the bricks of the city walls. A dozen black hooks formed a bridge above and below the city walls like a net, a bridge that crossed life and death. These were hooks that the Third Bureau had developed many years ago. When Fan Xian had gone to Northern Qi as a diplomatic envoy, the council had urged him to use them. However, Fan Xian had his own life-saving tricks, so he had not used them. However, he had to save all his time and forcefully break through the city walls. Fan Xian had long made preparations. He rode alone to the foot of Jinyang Gate. As the autumn rain above his head gathered slightly, the black hooks flashed through the sky like countless shadows. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt and forcefully suppressed the restlessness of his Jinqi brought about by exhaustion and exhaustion. Tyrannical Jinqi was released abruptly. Stepping onto the horse's back, he relied on the subtle feeling of the surrounding airflow to fly straight up. With a boom, his power was like a clap of thunder. Like a large black bird, he flew higher and higher in front of Jingdo's sinister city gates. Cut the rope! Cut the rope! The commander of Jinyang Gate yelled at the top of his lungs. He didn't dare have the soldiers shoot at the black figure, because he didn't know if he would be executed by the emperor and his entire family if he killed Sir Fan Jr. The commander of Jinyang Gate was afraid, but Fan Xian was not. With an explosive roar, he forcefully raised the Jinqi in his body again. His fingertips touched the black hooks. His entire body floated up like a wisp of black smoke. Following the hooks, he swept toward the top of the city walls. One hook was cut through, and there was another. When a dozen hooks had been cut through at full speed by the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards, Fan Xian, covered in dust and exhausted, had already swept to the top of the city gates. There was a sharp flash of light. The Wei Emperor's sword he had always carried on his back was unsheathed. The tip of the sword pierced through the throat of the commander of Jinyang Gate. Fresh blood sprayed out. Suddenly it swept back. The commander collapsed to the ground. Fan Xian swept past his body like a gust of wind. Using the price of 3 shallow wounds on his body, he broke through the valiant Qing army's defense on the city walls and flew down the long stone steps. The sword light flashed again. He immediately killed 3 people and stole a horse. Squeezing his legs, he followed the straight path in the direction of the royal palace. Fast. All of this could only be described as fast. It was faster than when he had dodged Wu Zhu's wooden stick on the cliff in Danzhou. It was faster than when he had broken into the royal palace and fiercely subdued the Empress Dowager. From a moment he learned of this news to now killing his way into Jingdo, Fan Xian had already displayed abilities that surpassed his realm. The fear in his heart made him unprecedentedly valiant and cold-blooded. Fresh blood was on his sword and body, but his expression did not change at all. He felt an unprecedented fear and panic in his heart. Looking at the situation in Jingdo, that person who should be waiting for him would probably not be able to wait for him. You have to wait for me. Fan Xian repeated it again in his heart. He allowed the autumn rain to hit his dust-covered face as he sped like crazy toward the royal palace. The royal palace was near, and the autumn rain was heavy. There were not many people on the streets. Where were the people gathered? Fan Xian thought with some confusion and fear. Then he heard waves of cheers and then silence. A death-like silence. The people in Jingdo could not hear the silence. Only Fan Xian could hear it. He heard it with great fear. The people in Jingdo only heard the sound of hooves in the silence. Clop, clop, clop. The people only heard the sound of hooves in the silence. Then they saw the black knight charging like lightning. They saw the tattered and dirty black official's robes in the autumn rain and the stern and murderous face of the person on the horse. The people watching the execution on the square in front of the royal palace suddenly became restless. Cries of surprise and wretched cries rang out at almost the same time. The ripples at the back of the sea of people were chaotic. Countless people were trampled and injured. The lone rider did not slow down at all. Instead, he charged directly and coldly toward the densely packed crowd. Those who could dodge did so. Those who could not were sent flying by the horse. In the autumn rain, the horse's hooves were unusually cold-blooded. The sea of people parted under the fear of death. They squeezed to the side with all their might, opening up a path that led directly to the small execution field below the royal palace for the rider. The imperial soldiers closed in. Their long spears were like a forest, pointing directly at the rider. Fan Xian flew up silently and passed through the forest of spears. In midair, his sword was already in his hand. Like lightning, he slashed out horizontally. With a number of swishing sounds, he sliced through a number of long swords and knocked down a few internal court guards. He had already swept into the air above the execution field. No matter what he did, Fan Xian's eyes remained fixed on the small wooden platform. He looked at the bloody, dying old man tied to the wooden frame. Fan Xian's gaze grew colder and more resentful. Then he heard the wind coming from all around him. Countless hemp-clothed shadows swept up and circled in the autumn rain like flying flowers, sealing off all of Fan Xian's paths. Fan Xian did not retreat or dodge. He received 3 palms on his chest and back. His sword also stabbed ruthlessly into the face of a hemp-clothed man, piercing viciously into his eye. Fresh blood and eye fluid spurted out at the same time and mixed with the rain. He roared wildly and slapped out with his left hand. It was very tyrannical. There was only the sound of his wrist bones cracking. The hemp-clothed man on his left was shaken until blood flowed from his nose, mouth, and mouth. With a slap, Fan Xian's feet finally stood on the wet wooden platform. He had paid a great price. The injuries in his body exploded out, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. He did not care. He only stared in a daze at the old man on the wooden frame, the old man who had been cut countless times and exposed to the eyes of the people to receive endless humiliation. With just one glance, Fan Xian knew that he had returned too late. He had no way of letting the other person continue to live. His dry lips opened slightly. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't say anything. The autumn rain fell and landed on the bodies of the old man and the young man on the wooden platform. There was a deathly silence all around. All of the imperial army, internal court aces, and powerful ascetic monks of the Qing temple surrounded the wooden platform tightly. Under the suppression of Fan Xian's powerful killing intent and suicidal methods earlier, everyone's bodies were stiff. No one could take a step forward. Fan Xian walked forward with great difficulty. Pulling off the ropes, he held Chen Pingping's thin body in his arms. He took off his black Overwatch council robe, which was covered in mud and holes, and covered his body. Chen Pingping opened his eyes with great difficulty. His old, muddy, and messy eyes shone with a pure light. He was like a child. The old man was like a child curled up in Fan Xian's arms. It was as if he was afraid of the cold. I came back too late. Fan Xian held the thin body and felt the old man's warmth slowly ebbing away. His heart was filled with an unprecedented sense of defeat, despair, and sadness. A hopeless and helpless struggle is perhaps a kind of tragic beauty. Yesterday, I said that I love Chen Pingping. In reality, I have never loved Fan Xian. I will explain this to everyone in detail in the future. However, Fan Xian today is the day I love the most in his life. Sadly, it is also the last day he and Chen Pingping will be together. I wrote based on my emotions and moved with it, whether it was happy or sad. I wanted to say that I would write less these days, but I couldn't stop my fingers. This is probably the time I have been most invested in these days. This kind of feeling is rare. I should treasure it. Chapter 704. The early autumn rain grew heavier and heavier. When it landed on the ground, it created splashes. When it landed on the body, it drenched the lapels of clothing. When it landed on the heart, it was incomparably cold. The square in front of the royal palace was completely enveloped in the misty rain. All one could see was a wet world. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the small wooden platform in the autumn rain, looking at the two people on the platform. There was a deathly silence all around. No one knew what kind of emotion had infected and controlled them. No one spoke, no one moved. They just stared at each other, their gazes piercing through the heavy rain and focusing on the platform. Hundreds and thousands of imperial soldiers, internal court aces, and ascetic monks of the Qing temple stood nervously and solemnly in the rain like frozen wooden figures. In just a moment, a number of people had already died at Sir Fan Jr.'s hands. Most importantly, the rain was falling bitterly. They did not know what color of emotion flashed through the eyes of the emperor on the palace walls. Yin Bingyan had already recovered from his shock when he first saw Fan Xian's figure. He lowered his head and began to prepare for what might happen next. In a low voice, he gave orders to the most loyal subordinates at his side. These voices were covered by the rain. No one heard them. However, a few Overwatch Council secret agents wearing normal clothing had already begun to push their way through the crowd toward the execution field. Above and below the palace walls, the officials and commoners were all stunned by the scene of Fan Xian's horse's hooves trampling through the blood, drawing his sword in rage in the rain, and taking off his clothes to cover the old man's body. The first person to react was He Zhongwei, who had the highest position in the royal palace and was responsible for supervising the execution. When Fan Xian rode into the sea of people, he had already reacted. Using the fastest speed and the most inconspicuous movement, he quietly left the area of the small wooden stage and hid his figure behind the officials and guards. Separated by many aces, his gaze passed through the wet shoulders and straw hats. He looked at Fan Xian alone and wretchedly holding Chen Pingping's thin and weak body on the small wooden stage. A complicated emotion flashed through He Zhongwei's eyes. He just didn't want to die, but he had to kill both the old man and the young man on the wooden stage. There were still many people who did not want to die. On the wooden stage, Fan Xian's entire body emanated a frightening coldness. Even the cold autumn rain between heaven and earth could not suppress it. Everyone unconsciously left the wooden stage. Eunuch Yao had long retreated into the group. He didn't want to become the next straw dog the Duke used to sacrifice to Chen Pingping. Several corpses were scattered around the wooden platform. The color of the blood was quickly diluted by the autumn rain. The trembling executioner of the Ministry of Justice, holding a sharp knife, had become the closest person to the bottom of the wooden platform. He looked at Sir Fan Jr. on the stage and found that Sir Fan Jr. had his head lowered deeply and was holding Director Chun tightly in his arms. It was as if he could not hear any other sounds in the world. His heart was filled with shock as he quietly retreated. After only taking 2 steps, The executioner's throat snapped with a crack. His head fell heavily into the rain. The headless body also fell off the stage with a heavy thud. Everyone was shocked and focused on the stage. Only those with high cultivation could notice that in that instant, Fan Xian's hand had moved slightly. A black dagger flew out and landed in the rain. Fan Xian sat cross-legged on the wooden stage. He sat under the gazes of tens of thousands of people, but it was as if he couldn't feel any of their gazes. He only held Chun Pingping's body and buried his head very low, allowing the rain to fall on his head and body. His back view was slightly slanted and appeared very desolate. The old man's body in his arms was very light. Holding him in his arms was like holding a ball of wind that could disperse at any moment. Under his slightly messy hair, Fan Xian's pale face twitched slightly. Unconsciously, he stretched out his hand and grasped Chun Pingping's cold and old hand. He held it tightly, unwilling to let go again. The old man had experienced a great deal of suffering in this life. He had been disabled for half his life, and the qi and blood in his body had long been exhausted. When he was being cut by 1,000 cuts, other than pain, there was not much blood. However, the torture of so many cuts still caused the blood to pool uncontrollably. It soaked the black Overwatch Council robes Fan Xian had covered his body. It was sticky, hot, and scalding to the hand. In the autumn rain, Fan Xian gently held his thin and weak body, terrified of causing him more pain. He held his cold hand tightly, terrified that he would leave just like this. If you don't want to come back, who can make you come back? Why did you drag me to Dongi? Fan Xian said in a low and raspy voice. His dry lips had been soaked in the rain until they were white and peeling. He appeared very pitiful. Who have I worked hard for these years? Who have I not wanted you old people to be able to leave Jingdo and live a good life? I have always worked hard. You know that I know everything. Fan Xian's head lowered even more and gently leaned against the old man's wrinkled cheek. His body swayed gently in the rain, as if he was coaxing the old man in his arms to sleep. His hand suddenly tightened. The old man's hand gripped Fan Xian's hand tightly. However, all of his life force couldn't even hold one hand tightly. He didn't know whether it was because he couldn't bear to part with something or because he was afraid of something. In the wind and rain, on the ground, and in the water, he wanted to hold onto something. Like a knife slowly tearing at his heart. Fan Xian's entire body was cold and terrified as he looked at the old man in his arms. He knew that he could not hold on much longer. Unconsciously, he tightened his grip on that hand until his fingers began to turn white and ache faintly. Chun Pingping's muddy and scattered gaze slowly moved through the rain. He saw the familiar royal palace, the sky covered in rain clouds, and the blurry figure of the emperor on the palace walls. However, he could not clearly see the person's face. Then he saw Fan Xian's face beside him. A glimmer of a smile flashed through the old man's muddy but clear eyes. The old man knew that he was about to leave the world he had lived in his entire life. His eyes gradually dimmed. He could not clearly hear any sound between heaven and earth. The light in front of him also gradually transformed into strange shapes. In this instant, perhaps his legendary life flashed quickly before his eyes like a slideshow. The little eunuch, the East Sea, that woman, the Overwatch Council, the Black Knights, another woman, dead people, conspiracies, revenge. All sorts of scenes flashed before his eyes and formed a white line that no one dared to look directly at. No one knew exactly what he saw before he died and what he wanted to see the most. Was it the mud that had been kicked up by the fighting in King Cheng's manor? Was it the plum blooming in winter in Taiping courtyard? Was it the little fish swimming freely in the shallow pond in the back courtyard of the Overwatch Council's square and sinister building? Was it the palace robes in the mountains in the north? Or was it the little boy in Danzhou who had entrusted all of his emotions and hopes for the second half of his life? Amidst the sound of wind and rain, Chun Pingping suddenly heard some sounds. It was singing. It was a graceful and familiar song. It was a song he had heard countless times in Qinggarten. Those concubines were all beautiful. Those songs were all beautiful. The old man had risen and fallen in the darkness all his life. He was cold and cruel, but he had the most gentle desire to collect and love beauty. If tragedy was to destroy the beauty of the world for others to see, then Chun Pingping's life was only to destroy what he thought was ugly and filthy. He threw himself into the ugliness and filthy, and then looked at all the beautiful things from a distance. If I hear the sound of rain, who will be happy? After climbing mountain after mountain, there's a happy song in the rain. Hearing the song, my mood will be happy. This was a song that the women of Chin Garden had once loved. In the wind and rain, it once again rang out in Chun Pingping's ears. With difficulty, he opened his eyes and looked at the people in the world. Hearing this graceful voice, his bloodless lips moved slightly. It was as if he was singing along, but no sound came out of it. Chun Pingping suddenly looked at Fan Xian and asked, "Chest?" Fan Xian gave a very ugly smile and said by the old man's ear, "It's a gun. A firearm that can kill from a long distance." This was probably the last question Chun Pingping had in his life, so he asked it at the last moment. Hearing Fan Xian's answer, the old man's eyes lit up slightly. It was as if he had not thought it would be this answer. He was slightly surprised and relieved. A gurgling sound came from his throat as he panted hurriedly. A cold and proud expression rose to his face. "This thing, I also have it." Fan Xian didn't say anything. He just sat in the autumn rain and gently held him. He gently shook his head. He felt the old body in his arms grow softer and softer. The old hand he held tightly in his hand grew colder and colder. In the end, there was no longer any warmth. Chun Pingping died. He died in the arms of the little boy he loved the most in the autumn rain. Before he died, he knew the truth about the chest. His face still carried a cold, proud, and insufferably arrogant expression. Fan Xian woodenly held the gradually colder body. He lowered his head and pressed it against the old man's icy face. He quietly said a few words. Suddenly, he felt that the wind and rain that filled the sky were like knives cutting into his body. It caused him great pain and was difficult to bear. This pain burst forth from his heart and traveled to every inch of his skin. It was like a death by 1,000 cuts. In the end, it finally exploded out. On the little wooden stage in the autumn rain, a loud cry suddenly exploded. It was a cry that broke one's heart. It was a cry that tore at one's liver and pained one's lungs. It was a cry that was so sorrowful that the autumn rain didn't dare to fall. It was a cry that tens of thousands of people couldn't bear to hear. In the 20 years since his rebirth, Fan Xian had never cried to anyone. Even though there were a few times when his eyes were wet, he forcefully pushed them down. No one in this world had ever seen him cry. No one had ever seen him cry so thoroughly and with such sorrow. A myriad of emotions were all vented in this loud cry. The tears were unable to blur his face. They only washed away the remaining dust on his face that not even the autumn rain could wash away. Just like how the autumn rain could not be stopped, the tears could not be stopped either. Just like this, endless sorrow surged out of his eyes. The sorrowful cry from the small wooden platform in the execution field penetrated the autumn wind and autumn rain and spread to every corner of the royal palace. It pierced into everyone's ears and caused countless people to immediately feel grief in their hearts, a chill in their hearts. When this cry landed in some people's ears, it gave rise to a powerful sense of fear. Other than this, it was a clear signal. Old director Chun had finally died. No one knew if there were people who secretly rejoiced or let out a large breath because of this fact. However, not a single official in the wind and rain showed any emotion on their faces. Perhaps sorrow flashed through some eyes. Most of them maintained their solemnity and slight nervousness, as well as a faint sense of loss at the bottom of their hearts. One of the pillars of the Qing kingdom had snapped. The civil officials, who had been suppressed by the Overwatch Council in darkness for decades and could not catch their breath, and who were like fire and water in the court disputes, suddenly felt a chill in their hearts. The ancestor of the Overwatch Council had died, just like this. They seemed to find it difficult to accept this reality for a moment. In their eyes, it seemed that this terrifying figure covered from head to toe in black fog would never die. Countless people thought of countless scenes because of Chun Pingping's death. No one dared to deny the work Chun Pingping had done for the Qin kingdom over the decades of wind and rain. In this long scroll of history, the thick black ink used to illuminate the clear was this person and the Overwatch Council he had created. Without this ink, where would this long scroll have its spirit? When Fan Xian's cry pierced through the wind and rain and reached the top of the royal palace walls high above, no one noticed that the Qing emperor, dressed in dragon robes and imposing with an imperial aura, had made a very small movement. His entire body leaned forward slightly, only the distance of 2 fingers. A moment later, the emperor valiantly straightened his back again, maintaining the distance between his emotionless face and the execution field filled with the scent of blood in the rain. No one noticed that the emperor's hands, hidden in the sleeves of his dragon robes, were slowly clenched tightly. At this moment, he watched his old companion and servant, who had followed him for decades, die. The old man who had watched him go from an unremarkable heir to the most dazzling warrior in the world died so decisively. What did the emperor think? What did he feel? Was it a kind of emptiness that came from the depths of his heart, or a kind of anger that even he could not explain and had no idea where it came from? At the top of the royal palace walls, Yin Bingyun lowered his head deeply, even lower than all the officials beside him. His body faced the direction of the execution field. Through the curtain of rain, he could still see Sir Fan Jr.'s indifferent and wooden appearance as he held the old director's body. His body trembled slightly. He thought of the words the old director had once said to him in the square building of the Overwatch Council. "One day I'm going to die. Fan Xian will go crazy." Yin Bingyun abruptly raised his head and took a deep breath. Wiping away the rain on his face, he continued to secretly give orders to all sides. The secret agents hidden in the crowd, watching the execution, could act at any moment. He wanted to compress the madness that could happen next into the smallest possible area. Of course, Yin Bingyun hoped that none of this would happen. The person had died. Although the death by 1,000 cuts had not been completely completed and the executioner had been cut in half by Fan Xian with resentment, there was no need to continue. The autumn rain continued to fall miserably, but no one left the square in front of the royal palace. It was as if everyone knew what was about to happen. The ascetic monks surrounding the execution field slowly approached the little wooden stage. The straw hats on their heads blocked the rain falling from the sky and hid the original expression on their faces. It was as if Fan Xian could not sense the danger below the stage. He just sat numbly on the wooden stage. He continued to hold Chun Pingping's body and did not put it down. His tears had already mixed with the rain and gradually stopped. Fan Xian suddenly stood up. However, his figure swayed slightly. It looked like these days and nights of traveling thousands of li had exhausted him. The anger and sorrow that pierced his heart made his state of mind show signs of exhaustion. However, the figure on the wooden stage swayed in the rain. This startled the hearts of the people around the wooden stage. They unconsciously took half a step back. Fan Xian indifferently held Chun Pingping's body and walked down the wooden stage. He didn't even glance at these people. It was as if they didn't exist. These people surrounded the wooden stage and waited for the order from the emperor in the royal palace. The emperor looked at the scene below the palace walls with a pale face. Complicated emotions flashed through his deep eyes. Starting from the Hanging Temple incident, his admiration for Fan Xian was built on the foundation that his son was a loyal and righteous person. Although he had not thought that Fan Xian would be able to make it back, he did not find it strange when he saw this scene. Even the emperor was not worried. In his heart, he thought Ji was a pitiful child who had been deceived by Chun Pingping, that old dog. Perhaps Ji still did not know how much Chun Pingping wanted to kill him, kill all of his sons, and cut off his line of descendants. When he looked at Fan Xian's desolate figure, the emperor could not suppress the sadness and anger he felt. He was hurt by what Fan Xian had demonstrated. He was angry that even though Chun Pingping, that old dog was dead, he could still easily steal the heart of his favorite son. Just like that woman who had died many years ago. The emperor was silent for a long time. The injury that he had forcefully suppressed also gradually split open because of the agitation in his heart. Blood seeped out his chest and onto the dragon robe he wore. It was particularly shocking. He shook out his sleeves and left the top of the palace walls with a cold expression. Below the royal palace, Fan Xian carried Chen Pingping's body and left the little wooden stage soaked in the rain and blood. He walked toward the west side of the square. His steps were particularly slow and heavy. Until now, he still did not glance toward the top of the palace walls. The emperor had already left. No one in the world dared to block Fan Xian's path. Everyone unconsciously opened up a path. The crowd was like the surface of the sea being cut open by a sword. The waves gradually rose and opened up a path through which reefs could be seen. In the rain, Fan Xian carried Chen Pingping and left. Who was a great hero? How could one be called a hero? This was a question that everyone had different opinions about. In this story, all the people who were loyal to their own way of thinking were actually extraordinary people. It just depended on how much they were willing to pay for this way of thinking. The more they were willing to pay, the more they were shocking enough. In particular, the word heroic was actually only heroic and did not involve anything else. When it came to men, one could not be called man just because they had asterisk asterisk. It was also not possible to be spiritually impotent. Although Chen Pingping was a eunuch, he was actually an idealist. He was a simple person, a man with a gun. He was more manly than most men. The last sentence he said, "I have that thing too," was my opinion of Chen Pingping ever since I wrote this story. Chapter 705. The first two rains of early autumn came and went abruptly, with an inexplicable feeling. It seemed that the first rain was just to welcome Chen Pingping back, and the second rain was to send Chen Pingping away. When everything on the execution field in front of the imperial palace came to an end, the misty autumn rain stopped just like that. The dark clouds in the sky were blown away, revealing an extremely high, faint, and clear sky. Other than the wet rain in the streets and on the black bricks, everything returned to normal. The people of Jingdo saw such a shocking scene, but no one dared to discuss anything. They silently dispersed along the various streets. The officials in front of the palace gates looked at each other. They didn't know what to do next. The emperor had already returned to the palace. The little duke carried the old director's body and left. The rainwater flowing all over the ground did not converge into one, making them very confused. After thousands of years of traveling back to Jingdo, Fan Xian and the 500 Black Knights had already broken countless Qing laws and Overwatch Council rules. Furthermore, when he had broken into Jingdo, he had casually killed so many court officials. Additionally, he had caused a disturbance on the execution field in front of the emperor. Logically speaking, this was an unforgivable crime. However, the emperor had not spoken. Who could punish Fan Xian for his crimes? Who dared to punish Fan Xian for his crimes? Who the scholar walked down from the top of the royal palace walls. Many officials bowed to him. This scholar had maintained his silence. He looked at the faint traces of blood on the wooden stage that had been washed away by the autumn rain. His brows suddenly twitched. Turning his head back, he saw the former scholar, Shu Wu, who seemed to have aged a dozen years in an instant, leave desolately along the foot of the city walls. He did not greet these people, who the scholar's heart dimmed slightly. He knew he could not be controlled by such emotions. Sir, he had already entered the palace. He had to stay here and sort out his funeral. His gaze slowly swept across the faces of the officials of the 6 ministries, 3 temples, and 3 courts. Calmly, he said, "The great punishment has ended. Open the city gates. Everything will be as usual." Hearing these words, the officials in front of the royal palace involuntarily let out a big breath. They had been terrified about how to handle Sir Fan Jr.'s matter. Looking at the situation, at least for a short period of time, the emperor would be able to control his anger and not hand such a dangerous task to his officials to handle. who the scholar did not care about these officials' reactions. His eyes narrowed slightly. He did not see anyone from the Overwatch Council in the 6 ministries, 3 temples, and 3 courts. This was normal. The heads of the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council were all locked up in the prison. Serene Jr. seemed to have quietly left a long time ago. It was not only the Overwatch Council that had been controlled from the inside and outside. A heavy expression flashed through the scholar's brows. He knew that there were also people in the royal palace who had been controlled, such as Lady Ning and King Jing, who had risked their lives to ask the emperor for mercy this morning. They were both under house arrest in the royal palace, and their situation was unknown. Furthermore, after Miss Fan had treated His Majesty last night, it seemed that she had not come out. Thinking of these things, and the tens of thousands of Qing elite troops still stationed outside the Overwatch Council, a chill rose in the scholar's heart. He knew he had to immediately find Fan Xian and say something to this little duke who had the power and courage to oppose the royal palace. The noon sun shone fiercely on the Lu Jing River outside Jingdou. The river water was clear and cold. It was only slightly warm, but no cheerful fog rose. Across the river was an elegant courtyard that stood aloof from the world. It had gray-white walls, green and yellow bamboo, and a threatening coldness. The water on the tiles had been left wet by the sun, but there was an additional sense of the summer heat of turning back time. In the stifling heat of early autumn, a black carriage sped past the bamboo sedan beside the Lu Jing River and stopped steadily in front of the courtyard. This courtyard had been Yi Qingmei's former residence, the place where the eldest princess had died, and where Fan Xian had once bowed to the river several times. After the Yi family incident, it had been taken into the palace treasury property by the royal family and became a courtyard. However, over the years, the emperor rarely came here. Furthermore, no concubine or prince dared to be so blind as to ask to temporarily live there. Thus, it had been empty for over 20 years. 3 years ago, when the eldest princess was planning the Jingdou incident, for some reason, she temporarily lived there for a few days. Because this courtyard was quiet and rarely visited, and because of the cold history it carried, it made everyone have the urge to keep a respectful distance. Thus, the internal court did not look after this place with much care or strictness. There were only 4 royal guards stationed there. Seeing the black carriage disregard the royal seal outside the courtyard and charge directly in, the guards' expressions changed. They walked forward, but before they could say anything, they were restrained by a group of people surging out from behind the black carriage. They were disarmed and bound. An Overwatch Council official walked forward and silently pulled open the curtain. The sound of footsteps rang out slightly. Covered in rain, the pale-faced Fan Xian carried Chen Pingping's body down from the carriage. The rainwater on his body dripped down his black clothes and the Overwatch Council uniform on the old man in his arms, making a pitter-patter. The door to Taiping Courtyard opened. Fan Xian did not glance at his subordinates. Solemnly, he walked in. With a creak, the door closed behind him. The Overwatch Council officials immediately spread out and controlled all the important positions at the end of the bamboo bridge. They watched their surroundings cautiously. After a while, a hurried and slightly chaotic sound of hooves rang out. Hundreds of exhausted black riders rode over along the road on the other side of the Lu Jing River. Immediately after, another thunderous sound of hooves stopped a bit further away. No one knew if it was the Jingdou garrison or the Imperial Army. Finally, a black carriage drove over and stopped on the other side of the bamboo bridge. An official with a frosty expression stepped out of the carriage. It was Yin Bingyun. He did not cross the bridge. He only looked calmly at the Overwatch Council officials at the other end of the bridge. Other than a few members of the Qinian unit scattered throughout Jingdou, most of the Overwatch Council officials who had followed Fan Xian to Taiping Courtyard were officials of the First Bureau. With the help of the palace, Yin Bingyun temporarily controlled the situation in the square and sinister building of the Overwatch Council. However, he was unable to control all 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council, particularly the First Bureau. Fan Xian had once been powerful and impressive in the First Bureau. The officials of the First Bureau all treated Fan Xian like an ancestor. Not long after the curtain fell on the show in front of the royal palace, and Fan Xian left the square in front of the palace with Chun Pingping's body, an official of the First Bureau drove a black carriage to receive him. Yin Bingyun narrowed his eyes and looked at his colleagues at the other end of the bridge. He did not feel anything strange about the high prestige Fan Xian had in the council, particularly in the First Bureau. He only felt it was strange. The emperor had also sent people to keep an eye on the First Bureau. News did not flow smoothly. Fan Xian had just returned to Jingdou. How did these First Bureau officials know? Furthermore, they had so coincidentally received him. This was truly puzzling. Yin Bingyun did not know that the young mistress of the Fan Manor had reacted as soon as the news of Chun Pingping's attempt to assassinate the emperor came out. She had already made preparations for her husband and had secretly maintained contact with the First Bureau the entire time. When Fan Xian rode alone into the execution field, the people of the First Bureau had already begun to move. As for the hundreds of exhausted Black Knights who could not be underestimated, they had received Fan Xian's earlier orders and were set to gather at Taiping Courtyard. Before Fan Xian entered the capital, he had thought it through. Regardless of whether or not he could save the old cripple, he and these people would probably have to meet at Taiping Courtyard. Yin Bingyun stood at the head of the bridge in silence for a long time. He tidied up his wet official robes and walked toward the bridge alone. The creaking sound continued. He finally reached the other end of the bridge. Under the wary, hateful, and disdainful gazes of the First Bureau officials and secret agents, he bowed and said in a heavy voice, "Yin Bingyun of the Fourth Bureau requests an audience with the director." Fan Xian didn't know that Yin Bingyun had already appeared outside Taiping Courtyard. He was certain that someone was coming to see him and persuade him. He could even accurately understand how many people follow behind him as he walked out of Jingdou step by step. How many of the Qin Kingdom's elite troops were gathered outside Taiping Courtyard, waiting for the success of his persuasion. Whether it was successful or not, this was all the emperor's will, right? He didn't think about this and couldn't be bothered to think about it. He only felt very tired and exhausted. His body was very empty. The jinshi that was usually as abundant as mountains and rivers seemed to have been spat out in that cry earlier. The turbid air in his chest had been spat out, and the jinshi had also been spat out. All that was left was emptiness. Fan Xian felt that his footsteps had never been as heavy as they were today. His body had never been as weak as it was today. The old man in his arms was clearly very light, but why was he becoming heavier and heavier? So heavy that he almost couldn't hold him anymore. His slightly damp hair fell on his forehead. He carried Chun Pingping across the grass, past the flowering tree and the little lake. He came to a secluded place. There were flowers on the wall. He gently plucked a small yellow flower that was curled up and blooming. Then he stretched out his hand and gently pressed on a corner of the flower wall. With a few creaking sounds, a hole slowly appeared on the ground. There were stone steps leading down, and it wasn't too far away. At this time, the sunlight from the sky could completely reflect on the dry stone slabs below. Presumably, it was no secret to the old people back then that there was a secret room in Taiping Courtyard. Even the young eldest princess had once found one in the courtyard. After the Yi family incident, the emperor should have come to the courtyard to investigate the whereabouts of the box. However, he did not find it. Additionally, he always had strange feelings toward the courtyard, so he never came again. For Fan Xian, this secret passage was very familiar. Many years ago, after he had opened the box, Uncle Wu Zhu had once brought him to Taiping Courtyard. Following this passage down, he had found the bullets that the fire stick needed the most. Step by step, he walked down as if he was walking into the netherworld. In reality, it was just a secret room about 30 feet off the ground. The room was clean and dry. There were no other furnishings or treasures. There were only a few chairs and a few coffins. Fan Xian placed one hand on the edge of the coffin and used a little force to lift the lid. He then carefully placed the old man's thin and weak body in his arms inside. Taking out a small porcelain pillow, he carefully placed it behind his head. Looking at the silk inside the coffin, Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and did not close it for him. Chen Pingping's eyes were tightly closed. His naked body was only covered by the Overwatch Council robes that Fan Xian had taken off. Fan Xian stood by the coffin and quietly looked at his thin cheeks and sunken eyes. He suddenly felt that this completely black clothing was more suitable than those beautiful silks. The completely black clothing was the Overwatch Council's official robes. What Fan Xian had taken off was the uniform of the director of the Overwatch Council. In Fan Xian's opinion, Chen Pingping's life was difficult to say. Presumably, he would like to die as the director of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian stood quietly by the coffin and looked at the sleeping Chen Pingping. He thought of how on the execution field earlier in the autumn rain, this old man seemed to have gradually fallen asleep in his arms. Before he fell asleep, he held his hand tightly. He shouldn't be afraid, right? Looking at the old and pale face, Fan Xian suddenly thought of many things. When he was very young, this old man, who liked to put a wool blanket on his knees, had teacher Fei Jiet teach him so that he could learn the ability to protect himself in this dangerous world. From a young age, he had familiarized himself with all of the rules and structure of the Overwatch Council. Probably from the day he was born, the old man had already decided that he was going to leave the Overwatch Council, which he viewed as his most precious treasure to him. Fan Xian thought of the first time he saw Chen Pingping. It was in that dark room in the Overwatch Council. It was clearly the first time the two of them had met, but when he looked at the old cripple in the wheelchair, it was like seeing an elder he hadn't seen for a long time. A natural closeness wrapped around the two of them. That day, Fan Xian had lowered his head and gently hugged the thin and weak Chen Pingping. He pressed his face against it, just as he had hugged and pressed his face against it today. Watching the fish by the shallow pond, discussing the world, gently playing with the flowers, and dancing in the two wheelchairs in Chun Garden were probably things that could never appear again, right? He couldn't think about it anymore. Fan Xian closed his eyes tightly and immediately opened them. Lowering his body, he picked up the cowering little yellow flower in his hand and gently pinched it into the white hair at Chen Pingping's temples. After a long silence, Fan Xian didn't say anything more. He closed the lid of the coffin and picked up the large nails he had prepared at the side. Aiming them at the edge of the coffin lid, he channeled his qi into his palms and brought them down. A series of muffled thuds rang out. Fan Xian silently brought his palms down one by one and hammered all of the large nails down. He nailed the entire coffin firmly and shut the old man in another world, a world he would never be able to touch again. After doing all this, Fan Xian looked at the black coffin in a daze. This was only a temporary solution. There would come a day when Fan Xian would send the old man back to his hometown or a place no one knew about. He would not let him stay forever near this dark Jingdou. Although this was Taiping Courtyard and presumably Chen Pingping liked to live here, it was still too close to Jingdou and the royal palace. Fan Xian's body swayed slightly. He felt a boundless tiredness and exhaustion began to surge into his heart. He sat down on the tall wooden chair beside him. Placing his legs on the side of the chair, he buried his head deeply between his knees. His hands hung weakly by his side. The cut on his right palm from a nail began to bleed. The blood dripped onto the ground. Fan Xian sat with his head buried. He didn't know how long he sat. The rainwater that had accumulated on the lawn of Taiping Courtyard above his head began to flow down the stone steps, wetting layer by layer and cooling layer by layer. The sunlight slowly moved in the sky. The light in the dark underground room also flickered between bright and dark. No one knew whether it was the angle of the light or the thickness of the clouds that caused all of this. A sliver of sound traveled into Fan Xian's ears. He slowly raised his head from between his knees and walked down the chair. Glancing at the silent and dark coffin again, he walked up the wet stone steps. After a strange sound, the secret door above the stone room was tightly shut. No more sunlight or running water could seep in. The place returned to peace and darkness. Fan Xian walked along the grassy path beside the lake toward the door of Taiping Courtyard. When he was not far from the wooden door, he heard the low voice of a subordinate reporting. A complicated expression flashed across Fan Xian's cold face. He quietly said something and then sat down on a broken tree in the courtyard. The wooden door opened. Yan Bingyan walked in and stood in front of Fan Xian with his head lowered. He didn't speak for a long time. Perhaps he didn't know how to start. Starting from the day the palace began to move, you should have been involved from beginning to end. I don't want to miss out on any details. Fan Xian sat tiredly on the broken tree root with his right hand on his knee. His face was unhealthily pale. Yan Bingyan glanced at his right hand and found it was bleeding. His heart jumped slightly, but he didn't explain too much. Instead, he calmly said, "On the second day, I was summoned into the palace. After receiving an edict, I began to make arrangements. As for Scholar, he capturing Gouda in Dazhou, and the emperor using this matter to keep the director in Dazhou, and then using the Jingdo garrison to capture him, I only know the general situation and not the details." "Tell me the details you know." Yan Bingyan looked at Fan Xian, who had his head lowered. He found that Sir Fan Jr. was different from any other time. His facial expression was calm, so calm that it made one's heart tremble. It was not a reaction a normal person should have. From that morning when the Jingdo garrison escorted the black carriage into the capital, to the argument in the royal study in the royal palace, to the emperor being heavily injured, to Qin Pingping being injured by the porcelain cup and being sent to the Overwatch Council prison, Yan Bingyun didn't hide any details. He even clearly explained the ugly role he had played in all of it. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then slowly raised his head and looked at him. "Then, why are you following me now? Do you want to drag that old cripple back and come a few more times? Or do you want him to die without a burial?" Yan Bingyan didn't need to control his emotions in front of him. A sliver of unfeigned sorrow appeared on his face. In a raspy voice, he said, "I had to see you. I had to guarantee that you wouldn't go crazy." "Was going crazy? Rebellion?" The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. His laughter was full of coldness. "Aren't the Jingdo garrison and Imperial Army troops outside used to do this?" At this moment, smoke and dust were faintly discernible outside the courtyard. It had clearly just rained, yet it was dry. Who knew how many troops were lying in ambush outside the Taiping courtyard, and how many aces were used to suppress Fan Xian? Yan Bingyun valiantly controlled his state of mind. Looking at Fan Xian, he coldly said, "No matter what, the old director is already gone. No matter how angry you are, you can't change anything. Even if you can escape Jingdo, what can you do? Deng Ziyu is in Shiliang, Su Wanmao is in the palace treasury in North Min, Xia Qifei is in Suzhou, and the generals of the Qinian unit and the most powerful officials and secret agents in the council have all been sent out by me to places you control the most. Once you leave Jingdo, you can once again gather 60% of the Overwatch Council's power. But what can you do?" Fan Xian looked at him coldly and didn't say a word. "Very well. Presently, you are the master of Dongyi's sword hut. You have countless swordsmen under your command. Additionally, the Great Prince is currently leading 10,000 elite soldiers stationed in Dongyi. However, those 10,000 elite soldiers may not be completely under the Great Prince's control. Taking 10,000 steps back, would the Great Prince rebel against the Emperor because of you or the old director?" Yan Bingyun's lips were a bit dry. His throat was a bit congested with blood, but he still forcefully said, "The heir, Hongcheng, is in Dingzhou. He is your best friend. Even if he raises troops for you, would the Dingzhou army listen to him? It has to be said, in this world, only you have the power to stand against the Emperor. But you're still not a match for the Emperor. Are you done?" Fan Xian looked at him with narrowed eyes and tiredly shook his head. "If you want to convince me, shouldn't you take out the letter Chun Pingping personally wrote for you?" Yan Bingyun's body shook. He had thought that what he had done within the Overwatch Council these few days would anger Fan Xian. He had not thought that from the beginning. Fan Xian had already found out everything. Fan Xian looked at him. "Even if you took it out, I wouldn't want to see it. It is nothing more than to take care of the big picture and prevent the Overwatch Council from losing control for a moment and being forcefully wiped out by the Emperor. Thus, You must become the emperor's second dog and forcefully preserve this council. In order to win that man's trust, you must do some things. I know you don't feel good and comfortable. Fan Xian looked at the slightly absent-minded Yin Bingyun and coldly said, "But you brought this upon yourself. Do you think this is the joy of enduring humiliation? Wrong. You're just a fool. You're just going to listen to what Chen Pingping wants to do. If he wants you to kill him, you kill him." The old director is thinking on behalf of the thousands of lives of the Overwatch Council and the people of the world, Yin Bingyun said in a slightly raspy voice. Even if I suffer some misunderstandings and become a thorn in the side of the council officials, so what? Do I have to watch as the world falls into chaos? Why can't the world fall into chaos? Thinking on behalf of the people? Fan Xian suddenly laughed strangely. There was a coughing sound in his laughter. He coughed up a few threads of blood. How many of these people have thought on behalf of them? I don't forgive you. Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyun calmly. Each word he said made one tremble in fear. Everything for the Qing kingdom, everything for the emperor, everything for the world. This is your attitude, not mine. For the people I care about. So what if tens of thousands of people die? You didn't do all of this for me. So, I don't forgive you. Yin Bingyun knew that under Fan Xian's gentle exterior was a heart that loved and hated intensely. After a long silence, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "I don't need anyone's forgiveness." The old director's choice is the same as mine, so I did it. For the Qing kingdom, I can do anything. Very good. Only like this can you become a good official of the emperor. For those dead people, he might be a good emperor. Fan Xian slowly stood. For me, neither he nor your people I can place a sliver of trust in. In your hearts, there are things more important than companions. King Jing and Lady Ning are under house arrest in the palace. The young lady of the Fan family is also in the palace, Yin Bingyun said hurriedly as he suddenly felt cold. Fan Xian's voice in reply was mocking and cold. For the emperor, this is a matter of course. Watching Fan Xian walk tiredly toward the wooden door, Yin Bingyun's heart suddenly tightened. A difficult-to-suppress fear surged in his heart. It was not fear for himself. Rather, he was worried about Fan Xian. In a loud voice, he asked, "Where are you going?" Fan Xian's hand froze slightly on the wooden door. He didn't turn his head. Tiredly, he said, "Going home to sleep." Walking out of the wooden door of Taiping Courtyard, he looked at the officials of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council at the end of the bridge as if they were facing a great enemy. He looked at the hundreds of travel-worn Black Knights on the other side of the bridge who were forcefully suppressing their exhaustion and barely forming a defensive formation. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. On the other side of the bridge, at the other end of the green and yellow autumn forest, were the troops the emperor had used to suppress him. How could the subordinates he had hurriedly brought back to the capital stand against them? The bright sun dazzled his eyes. Only now did he realize that exhaustion and sorrow could harm humans to such an extent. His steps were weak as he walked across the bamboo bridge. He gently gave a few orders to the subordinates who were still fighting to the death to follow him in such a tense moment. The deputy commander of the Black Knights and the officials of the First Bureau were silent for a long time. They knew that the little duke was thinking about their lives. Without another word, they knelt on one knee on the ground. No one knew whether they were kneeling to the young director in front of them or the old director buried in Taiping Courtyard. After they knelt, the hundreds of people mixed together and retreated west along the beautiful and quiet Liushi River. Yin Bingyun, who had followed silently behind Fan Xian the entire time, glanced at those people with a complicated gaze. He followed him across the bridge and onto the road. He then saw the thousands of fully armored riders spread across the fields on the other side of the road. These riders were lined up densely, and their power was astonishing. Fan Xian looked expressionlessly at these powerful martial forces. With his hands behind his back, he slowly walked over. Under countless wary gazes, he walked in front of the commander. In a raspy voice, he said, "Have the scouts and ambushing soldiers withdraw. I want not a single one of my people hurt." Yizhong narrowed his eyes slightly. A cold light flashed through them. "I've caught a cold. It's been 2 days. I can't take it much longer. I've taken large amounts of medicine, but my entire body is still sore. My head is dizzy, and I feel very uncomfortable. There are a lot of good things missing in the book review section because the leader has also been sick recently. I really feel sorry for the friends who worked so hard to write reviews. If you have a long review, please send it to my email, xfsdz@hotmail.com. Also, thank you to the brothers in Shuemu who cast their illegitimate children. It's been a long time since I've gone diving. Yesterday, my thoughts jumped and I want to take a look. In the end, I saw the votes for idealism and rations. You like it? I'm very grateful. Chapter 706. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs of the Qing Kingdom, the foremost person in the military under the Emperor, Commander Yi Zhong, had personally led elite soldiers to Taiping Courtyard to suppress, monitor, and control Fan Xian. It had to be said that the Qing court and royal palace maintained a high level of respect and caution toward Fan Xian. This respect and caution was expressed through strength. Fan Xian's face was haggard and slightly pale. Streaks of muddy marks appeared very eye-catching on his handsome face. They were probably marks formed by the rain and dust from 1,000 li. He looked at Yi Zhong's slightly cold gaze on his horse. His entire person appeared wooden and indifferent. It was as if he did not see Yi Zhong and the thousands of fully armored riders. For people at Fan Xian and Yi Zhong's level of strength, they knew that on the plains, no matter how powerful an ace, it would be impossible to escape the pursuit of thousands of elite riders unless they had already entered the realm of a great grandmaster. However, this place was still on the outskirts of Jingdou. The dense forests, clear rivers, and houses were still densely packed. If Fan Xian truly gave up everything in Jingdou and fled like a giant bird into the woods, these thousands of elite soldiers would probably not be able to catch him for a while. The emperor had ordered Yi Zhong to personally lead troops to deal with this matter because he had thought of this. Among these thousands of elite riders, there were many aces from the military. Most importantly, there was Yi Zhong, who could face Fan Xian head-on. He was one of the few aces in the Qing kingdom who stood above the 9th level. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at Yi Zhong on his horse. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He thought of another matter and couldn't help smiling self-mockingly. In the beginning, there were 3 countries. Dongyi had the most 9th level aces. However, the Qing kingdom conquered the world with its knives and horses, so aces emerged in an endless stream. They had the most aces between the 7th and 8th level. There were even a number of aces who had entered the 9th level in Jingdou. However, all of this had become history. The Tiger Guards, who had gathered the most 7th and 8th level aces, had all sacrificed themselves to the vicious sword of Dongyi because of the emperor's caution toward the previous minister of revenue, Fan Jian. The aces of the military had all died in the Jingdou rebellion 3 years ago. Qin Yi and his son had both died in front of the royal palace. There was also old eunuch Hong, who had fallen on Dong Mountain, and the Qing temple's great priest and second priest who had died one after the other. Because of the emperor's schemes and paranoia, the top aces of the Qing kingdom had unknowingly been decreasing. Now, a large gap had appeared. In order to suppress Fan Xian, a superior 9th level figure, there was no one to send. They had to send the top person in the military, Yi Zhong, personally. I am very surprised that the heir to the High Duke can still smile. Yi Zhong had already slowly restrained the coldness in his eyes and said calmly, I was just thinking of a question. If even you and Gong Dian died, the emperor, who else would be trustworthy? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly as he spoke in a raspy voice. Yi Zhong's heart trembled slightly. He knew that Fan Xian had seen the present flaws in the Qing kingdom's martial power in a glance. Although the Qing Iron Riders were still unparalleled in the world, regardless of whether it was the Dingzhou army, the Yinjing camp, or the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army scattered across the borders who had once belonged to the Great Prince, they were all tigers and wolves on the battlefield. When it came to a small group of elites led by a strong warrior, It was difficult for the Qing kingdom to find an ace they could rely on. All the warriors in the world are in my hands. Fan Xian looked at Yi Zhong and slowly said. I don't care about the edict the emperor gave you earlier. I only know that if you don't immediately pull back the scouts and riders you sent out, there will be many scenes you don't want to see. All the warriors in the world are in my hands. How arrogant were these words? All the land under heaven belonged to the king. All the officials under heaven belonged to the king. As the most powerful emperor in the world, the Qing emperor should have the loyalty of most of the powerful warriors in the world. However, the situation had changed. Regardless of whether it was luck or coincidence, Yi Zhong had to admit that most of the truly powerful aces in the world had fallen into Fan Xian's hands. Although Yi Zhong did not know the truth of the assassination in the Hanging Temple, the scene on the execution field earlier made him certain that the true aces in the Overwatch Council, such as the mysterious head of the 6th Bureau and the legendary younger brother of Siga Jian, would follow Fan Xian's orders blindly. Most importantly, there were 13 disciples of the Sword Hut. Other than Yun Zhilan, who had already become the master of Dongyi, there were 11 other 9th-level aces. The emperor has not given you a clear edict, Yi Zhong said in a heavy voice. But those Black Knights and the 1st Bureau officials who followed you out of the capital have broken Qing law and are conspirators in rebellion. Do you think the court will let them live? It is me who wants to protect their lives. Fan Xian lowered his head tiredly. He felt that negotiating with Yi Zhong here was truly tiring. Slowly, he said, "You are a smart person. You know what to do. The emperor is currently angry. I heard he is also injured. I'm afraid it would not be wise to give an edict at this time. It is very difficult for me to control my emotions. I think you would not want to truly drive me crazy. Once I go crazy, it will not be good for you, me, the officials and people of the Qing court, or even that person in the palace." Fan Xian's body was hunched as he shook his head. You know what my bottom line is? Starting from the old cripple all the way to me, the style of the Overwatch Council is to protect our own. We will not allow our people to be harmed. I understand, but this is defying an edict. Yi Zhong calmly looked at the messy hair on Fan Xian's forehead. I am an official of the Qing kingdom. For all officials who break the law and rebel, I have the duty to capture and kill them. Don't say such useless things. Fan Xian waved his hand tiredly. There is no one else here right now. If you want to ensure the Dingzhou army's safety for 1,000 years, you'd better make a decision quickly. Yi Zhong and Fan Xian stood far in front of the riders. No one could hear their conversation. Even Yin Bingyun, who had been following Fan Xian the entire time, stood quietly by the black carriage and did not move forward. Yi Zhong thought silently for a long time. He then said, "Even if I let them go right now, the Black Knights under your command have been exhausted to the extreme. Regardless of whether you have them go to Shiliang to join Hongcheng or Dongyi to join the Great Prince, the soldiers stationed in the various provinces and counties along the way." Speaking to this point, Yi Zhong suddenly stopped and sighed in his heart. Knowing the inside story, he knew the court's arrangements these days. In the intelligence reports, Fan Xian was clearly far away outside Yanjing a few days ago. Who knew that he would rush back to Jingdou today? Thinking of this Qing military ace couldn't help but feel a sense of shock in his heart. He could not understand how Fan Xian had flown across thousands of li and brought hundreds of Black Knights back to Jingdou. As long as you don't personally act, those provincial soldiers cannot stop my people, Fan Xian said in a raspy voice. As long as I am willing to go with you, the emperor will not be angry at you for going easy on them. Yi Zhong was silent for a long time, then suddenly said, "That's true. As long as you are willing to return to the capital, the emperor's anger will lessen greatly." "See, isn't this a very simple matter?" Fan Xian said this expressionlessly. He then turned his head and walked directly into the black carriage Yin Bingyun was leading. Letting down the curtain, he closed his eyes and began to rest. The carriage jolted slightly and began to move forward on the road. Thousands of Qing elite riders seemed to be escorting as they followed the black carriage slowly toward Jingdou. They entered Jingyang Gate again and traveled on the quiet and austere street. Fan Xian, who had been resting with his eyes closed in the carriage, suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Are we going into the palace?" "No." Yizhong sat on the horse and straightened his not-so-tall figure. Calmly, he replied, "The emperor did not give an order. He only forbids you from leaving the capital." "Very good. Then I'll go home," Fan Xian said quietly as he closed his eyes again. Yin Bingyun, who was responsible for driving the carriage, had a slightly serious expression. He pulled on a rope and followed the fork in the road at the entrance of the salt market toward the south of the city. Some people in the dark followed the black carriage closely. Yizhong's subordinate riders also sent a group of people to catch up. Yizhong himself stood at the end of the street and did not make any movements. There were already people on the street. Although the scene on the execution field in the autumn rain had already spread like wildfire among the people, it was, after all, a distant matter and could not truly affect the lives of the people. Thus, life in Jingdo returned to normal following the end of the autumn rain. The people walking under the eaves and on the side of the road had long been herded to the two sides of the street by the soldiers. They watched this scene woodenly and looked at the black carriage surrounded by soldiers. Very easily, they guessed the true identity of the important figure in the carriage. For a moment, nervousness, excitement, confusion, worry, and many other emotions flashed through their eyes. Yizhong stood on the horse and watched with an indifferent expression as the black carriage slowly drove away in the direction of the south of the city. His heart felt unusually heavy. Logically speaking, the order to capture Fan Xian and bring him back to Jingdo and forbid him from leaving the capital had already been accomplished. However, he still could not relax. For one, under Fan Xian's naked and calm threat, he had no choice but to give up on the pursuit of the Black Knights traversing the fertile lands of the Qin Kingdom and the officials of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council who dared to defy the Emperor's edict. After he entered the palace in a moment, he didn't know what kind of ferocious rage he would receive from the Emperor. The coldest, hardest, and heaviest stone pressing down on his heart was Fan Xian's expression along the way. Yizhong knew that it was not him who had captured Fan Xian and brought him back to Jingdo. Rather, Fan Xian had followed him back to Jingdo. What chilled his heart was that Fan Xian had no intention of entering the palace to see the Emperor. Regardless of whether Fan Xian angrily criticized the Emperor or explained something to the Emperor, it was actually more comforting than Fan Xian's current indifference. That kind of indifference actually contained anger towards his majesty and suppressed coldness, as well as a kind of disregard for imperial power. Yizhong didn't know why Fan Xian had the courage to do this. He knew that the Cold War between the Emperor and Fan Xian had just begun. Perhaps the Emperor, who was currently recovering, was waiting in the palace for his illegitimate son to enter the palace to explain something or roar about something. However, Fan Xian had made all of the Emperor's hopes and predictions come to nothing. Yizhong slowly lowered his head and thought of Fan Xian's calm and powerful words outside Taiping courtyard earlier. He couldn't help but shake his head sadly. He had been forced to concede under Fan Xian's cold pressure. This proved that Fan Xian already had the power to directly oppose the power of the Qing military. Without a doubt, such power added many variables to the relationship between the Emperor and Fan Xian. Yizhong could even guess what the Emperor and Fan Xian were thinking. The Emperor would never voluntarily issue an edict for Fan Xian to enter the palace. He would wait for Fan Xian to enter the palace, and Fan Xian would never voluntarily enter the palace. He would wait for the man on the throne to speak first. This was the so-called contest of attitude, intentions, and willpower. The foundation of this contest lay in the difference in power between the two sides. More importantly, it lay in the powerful and icy hearts of both sides. Who would beat first? Yizhong took a deep breath. The expression on his face recovered its solemn calmness. Squeezing his horse, he prepared to enter the palace to report. The battle between his father and son was not something he, as an official, could interfere with. The reason the Dingzhou army had interfered was because of the Emperor's edict. It was clear that the Emperor's attitude toward Fan Xian, his illegitimate son, was completely different than that of his other sons. As the head of the Qing military, Yi Zhong only hoped that this battle would end peacefully or as quickly as possible. It wouldn't be like the autumn rain these 2 days, always making one feel cold and uneasy. The carriage stopped in front of the main gate of the Fan Manor in the south of the city. The street was completely silent. The two rain-soaked stone lions outside the gate stared with wide eyes, angrily and uneasily at the people walking around them. The tightly shut main gate immediately opened. A few manor guards carrying knives surged out and stood under the carriage. Fan Xian walked down from the carriage. He didn't glance at Yin Bingyun on the shaft. He only lightly swept his gaze around his surroundings. He easily saw that there were many spies watching. They were probably people sent by the palace. They were probably people raised by the 13 Yamens or the Supreme Court. Further away, the Overwatch Council secret agents were still there. A warm smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. In terms of surveillance, even if the entire court worked together, they might not be a match for the Overwatch Council. It looked like the secret agents he controlled were still in his hands and not yet controlled by the Emperor. He walked up the steps. Yin Bingyun sat on the shaft and sighed. He was just about to leave when he suddenly heard a sentence. I probably won't be able to manage the council for much longer. Fan Xian didn't turn his head. One of his arms was supported by a wife. Tiredly and with a glimmer of self-mockery, he said, "Originally, I didn't manage it for too long. However, I hope you won't make the mistakes you've made in the past. The reason the Overwatch Council is so united is not because of clear rewards and punishments. Rather, it is because we protect our own. Probably many people have already been imprisoned. In the future, it will be impossible for these old fellows to continue staying in their positions in the 8 bureaus." His back slowly straightened. If they've been taken, then they've been taken. But you have to ensure that they can live. If even they die, no matter how much you protect this stupid council, it will be meaningless. Do you understand? Yin Bingyun was silent for a moment. He then nodded, not caring whether or not Fan Xian could see it. Fan Xian sighed. With the support of his wife, he stepped into the Fan Manor's high doorstep. The moment he entered the Fan Manor, a familiar aura hit him in the face. It wrapped around Fan Xian's tired body and made him feel sleepy. This was probably the so-called power of home. However, Fan Xian forced himself to stand straight and walked on the stone path. He even left his wife's support. There were hidden weapons buried all around the manor. There were also guards walking solemnly. Everything was orderly and filled with a sense of sternness. This was the tradition of the Fan Manor. No matter how turbulent the outside world was, there would never be too many holes on the inside. During the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, the Fan Manor had made ample preparations. Now, the Fan Manor had also made preparations. This tradition was a rule set by his father while he was still alive. No matter how chaotic Jingdo became, to drag the Fan Manor down would require at least a forceful attack by hundreds of soldiers. Fan Xian looked at all of this with satisfaction. He knew that Warner had made ample preparations. Thus, he had to maintain his valiance and let the people of the Fan Manor, who saw him as their backbone, know that their young master had not fallen yet. Walking past the flower bed and into the back garden, he saw the gentle woman at the door to the flower hall. Fan Xian gazed at her and forced a smile. "I'm back." A mist gradually rose in Lin Wan-er's eyes, but she forcefully suppressed it. She had also just returned from the palace. Taking a few steps forward, she grabbed Fan Xian's icy hand and smiled sweetly. "It's good that you're back. Sleep first. You probably haven't slept for a few days. I haven't slept for 6 days. I didn't think I would be able to make it." Fan Xian's heart ached a little. He forced a smile and placed the weight of his body on his wife's shoulder. Walking toward the bedroom, he said in a warm voice, "These 2 days must have been hard on you." "Not hard at all." Lin Wana helped him into the bedroom. She found that there were some bloodstains on his palm. Her heart dimmed slightly, but she didn't say anything. She only had him sit down by the bed. Then, she ordered the servants to quickly bring hot water and help him wash his face. She also placed the copper basin used to wash his feet at his feet. Lin Wana sat on a little stool and helped him take off his shoes and socks. Only then did she realize that the many days of hard running, although he was riding a horse, had already made Fan Xian's feet and shoes seem to be connected. Particularly, the soles of his feet that were stepping on the stirrups had a deep, bloody mark. Lin Wan Er's heart ached. She carefully placed Fan Xian's feet into the basin of hot water. Fan Xian sighed. She didn't know whether it was because he was too comfortable or too sad. The outside of the courtyard is filled with people. There's no way to go in. Lin Wan lowered her head and gently rubbed his feet as she spoke quietly. The courtyard in this sentence referred to the square and sinister building of the Overwatch Council. When I left the capital earlier, some daring people from the First Bureau followed me out of the city. Fan Xian looked at the top of his wife's head and smiled warmly. I know it was you who told them. I've already arranged for them to leave. Don't worry. As for the courtyard, at least for now, the Emperor will not allow me to contact them. Lin Wan Er's hand froze slightly. She was worried about Fan Xian, but she was also thinking about whether or not she should say that matter. A moment later, she lowered her head and said in a trembling voice, Sister went into the palace yesterday to tend to the Emperor's wounds. She still hasn't come back. That's normal. Fan Xian had long heard this news from Yan Bingyun's mouth. Calmly, he said, the Emperor has always grabbed people's weak spots tightly. Only the old cripple didn't have any weak spots for him to grab. That's why he ended up like this today. Speaking of Chun Pingping, Fan Xian's face darkened. In reality, Chun Pingping's only weak spot in this life was Fan Xian. However, this old cripple still separated Fan Xian in such a hopeless situation, leaving the Emperor unable to grab hold of him. In the end, they could only walk into a deadlock. After saying this, Fan Xian fell asleep. With his feet in the basin and his head lowered to his chest, he fell into a deep sleep. Having not slept for a long time, he finally relaxed his state of mind in front of his wife. With a glimmer of unshakable sorrow on his face, he fell into a deep sleep. Lin Wan gently stopped the movements of her hands and looked at the haggard and sorrowful face. For some reason, sorrow welled up in her heart, and a few tears rolled down. She gazed at Fan Xian and thought, when did that bright and beautiful youth become so pitiful? Fan Xian slept for a full day and night. When he slowly woke up, he found that it was already dusk. The slightly dim light of dusk seeped in through the window and covered everything familiar in the room with a layer of unfamiliar light. Wan Er's voice came faintly from outside the window. It seemed that she was ordering the servants to do something. Fan Xian didn't want to startle her, so he continued to lie quietly in the warm, thin blankets. He didn't want to get up. Perhaps he knew that once he came out of the soft blankets, he would have to face what had already happened and what was about to happen. His gaze turned slightly and saw a towel by the bed. Extending his hand, he pulled it over and gently wiped the dirt at the corner of his eyes. Immediately after, he looked at his body and found that it was clean and fresh. It looked like Wan had wiped his body while he was sleeping. Just these two simple movements caused his entire body to ache with unbearable pain. The 1,000 miles of rushing, the valiant fighting, and the pain that seeped deep into his bones had indeed caused him to weaken to the extreme. It was absolutely not something that could be recovered with a simple sleep. Fan Xian lay quietly on the bed and slowly activated the two powers of Jinqi in his body, particularly Tianyi Dao's natural method, to recover his yuanqi. His gaze stared straight at the ceiling embroidered with complicated patterns and thought to himself, what is the man in the palace thinking at this time? Chapter 707. The vast expanse of white was very clean. The world was covered in melted snow. No one knew how deep it was. The snowy plain stretched straight to the horizon. No one knew how wide it was. At the other end of the horizon, a tall snowy peak abruptly rose, piercing straight into the clouds like a treasured sword thrust into the sky. This snowy mountain was very tall. It made one sigh in admiration and fear, not daring to get close. Fan Xian lowered his head and found that his bare feet were stepping in the snow. Strangely, he did not feel any icy pain. He could only clearly feel the touch of each snowflake. He felt strange. Narrowing his eyes, he looked toward the tall mountain in front of the snowy plains. His eyes were pierced by the light reflected off the ice and snow on the mountain walls. The world was very bright. It was like there were 9 suns above the snowy clouds. Fanxian didn't know how long he had walked in this snowy plain. 5 days? 6 days? He had not slept, but the sky had not darkened. It was as if there was no difference between day and night in this ghastly place. The last time I came, it was always night. Later, the heavens opened their eyes, and it became day. A voice rang out beside Fanxian's ear. He turned his head to look and saw a face he hadn't seen in a long time. The old face carried an unhealthy flush. It was obvious that it was a side effect of taking ephedra pills. Fanxian tilted his head and looked strangely at Xiao in, thinking, "Didn't you die? How could you appear in front of me and speak so clearly?" He felt it was strange, but there was a kind of unconsciously mental strength that stopped him from thinking about this strange question. Instead, he asked straightforwardly, "The temple is in that snowy mountain?" "Yes, that is the holy land of the human world, a place mortals cannot touch." Xiao inside. Then his face became countless specks of light and fragments that landed on the snowy ground and could not be found again. Fanxian crouched down and used his red hands to dig around in the snow. It was as if he wanted to grab the already dead Xiaoan back and continue to ask questions. After digging for a while, the snow pit grew deeper and deeper, but he couldn't find a trace. Instead, beside the gradually deepening snow pit, he saw a shadow. A hemp-clothed man wearing a straw hat was sitting beside the snow pit. His eyes were as clear as the ocean as he quietly watched the snowy mountain. "Where did your shoes go? Where are my shoes?" Fanxian jumped out of the snow pit and glanced at his bare and red feet. He then glanced at the similarly bare feet of the hemp-clothed man wearing the straw hat. His gaze passed through the straw hat and saw the man's bald head. With a smile, he said, "I know you are Kuhi. Back then, you also came to the temple. You and Xiaoan have both eaten human flesh." Sitting on the snowy ground, Kuhi smiled and said, "The temple is not holy. It is just an abandoned temple. But everyone in the world knows that you have boundless respect for the temple. You once knelt on the bluestone steps in front of the temple for several months before you received the ultimate skill. But you know that's not the case." Kui turned his head and looked calmly at Fanxian. What power in this world is undefeatable? After saying this, Kui disappeared. It was as if he had never appeared. In a flash, in the place where Kui had disappeared, the short-sword Saint Great Grandmaster suddenly appeared. With a pair of wide eyes, he roared angrily at Fanxian. "Where are my ashes? Where are my ashes?" Fanxian jumped in fright. Only now did he remember that he seemed to have forgotten something. He seemed to have promised Sigu Jian that if he went to the temple, he would bring his ashes and scatter them on the stone steps of the temple so that he could see what kind of extraordinary figure was in the temple. Fanxian was vexed and said, "That mountain is so tall and cold. I can't even get close. Even if I brought your ashes, it would be useless." "This is an excuse." Sigu Jian roared angrily. "It is just an excuse." Then, Sigu Jian's sword came thrusting forward. It swept up a snowflake that spread between heaven and earth. It was graceful, beautiful, and irresistible. Fanxian's face paled. Using all the strength in his body, his bare feet desperately stepped on the soft, snowy plains as he charged toward the snowy mountain in front of him that was so tall it seemed impossible to conquer. Then, he saw a black dot slowly and steadily heading up the snowy mountain. Fanxian was overjoyed. In a loud voice, he called out, "Uncle Wu Zhu, wait for me." It was like the black-clothed Wu Zhu did not hear any sound. He continued to coldly and firmly walk up the mountain. However, the sword behind Fanxian had already arrived. There was only one sword flower. In an instant, it bloomed into countless petals. Each petal sliced off a piece of flesh from Fanxian's chest. The boundless and endless pain made Fanxian cry out wretchedly. He fell to the ground. The blood from his body flowed onto the snowy ground and was immediately frozen into a deep red flower of blood. It was like precious and murderous agate. Fan Xian watched as Uncle Wu Zhu walked toward the snowy mountain. The snowy mountain was still tall and cold. He felt the unbearable pain from his heart and the despair and fear that filled his mind. Then he woke up. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt and struggled to sit up in bed. His body was covered in sweat and had soaked all of his undergarments. He unconsciously touched his chest and found that other than a little sore, there were no real pieces of flesh that had been sliced off. It was already night. It looked like after he had woken up at dusk, he had looked calmly at the top of the bed and then fallen asleep again. He didn't know why he had such a nightmare. The top figures who had once spread their elegance under heaven appeared one by one in his dreams and told him the story of the snowy mountain. They then persuaded him, encouraged him, and abandoned him. Fan Xian panted heavily and wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. He stared in a daze at the blanket on his body and thought of the snowy mountain in his dream. He still shivered despite not being cold. He knew what the snowy mountain in his dream represented in the real world. He also knew that man was actually more powerful and colder than the snowy mountain. However, with the snowy mountain in front of him, he had to climb it. In the royal study in the royal palace, the emperor slowly opened his eyes and woke up. He looked at the lights on the table around him. Only then did he know that it was already night. His gaze was cold and strange because he had a dream earlier. He dreamed that he was standing on a lonely snowy mountain, enjoying the worship and reverence of countless commoners on the snowy plains below. However, there was no one by his side. He was as lonely as the snowy mountain. Those commoners were about to be frozen into zombies. Perhaps there was not much joy to be taken from being worshipped by such creatures. The emperor slowly closed his eyes and thought of the eyes that had coldly watched him in his dream, the eyes of those familiar companions. He didn't speak for a long time. "I want to burn my face," the emperor said. Eunuch Yao, who had been waiting at the side the entire time, bowed and accepted the order. He pushed open the door to the royal study. Before he left, he quietly reported, "Sir Yizhong has been waiting in the front hall." The emperor didn't say anything. He waved his hand in annoyance, and the door to the royal study was closed. Although the Qing emperor had his own palace in the back of the palace, he had been diligent in state affairs for many years. Additionally, he had extraordinary energy and was used to staying up late in the royal study to examine memorials. There were all kinds of bedding set up here, so he rarely returned to the palace to rest. Instead, he often spent the night in the royal study. It would not be a lie to say that most of the Qing emperor's life was spent in the royal study. Usually, after nightfall, other than the emperor, only his most trusted eunuchs could enter this quiet study. After Eunuch Hong died and Hong Zhu lost power, the only person who could stay in the royal study at night was Eunuch Yao. However, there was another woman in the quiet study today. There was a natural sense of calmness between the lady's brows. Her face was delicate and pretty. She wore a thin half-fur shirt and sat quietly on the round stool opposite the soft mattress. There was a box by her feet. The emperor glanced at the woman and warmly said, "You haven't rested much these 2 days. In a moment, go to the back of the palace to rest." Fan Ruo bowed calmly and didn't say anything. Ever since she had been brought into the palace at noon the day before yesterday to tend to the emperor's wounds, her movements had been greatly restricted. Although no one had said anything explicitly, she knew she had to stay in the palace. During these 2 days, the emperor had kept her by his side. Even when he was in the royal study looking at matters, and when his subordinates reported on information related to the Fan Manor, Fan Ro was always at the side, listening quietly. The emperor did not seem to avoid her. The emperor glanced at her lightly and easily saw a glimmer of deep worry in the calmness between her brows. He knew what she was worried about. Strangely, the emperor had kept the young lady of the Fan family by his side, not just to suppress Fan Xian or because Fan Ro wanted to tend to his wounds. Rather, the emperor felt that this niece's refreshing and indifferent nature suited his temperament. Furthermore, when he casually chatted with her, regardless of whether it was about astronomy, geography, or the various sights of the world, Fan Rou was always able to say a word or two to the emperor. "Don't worry about anything." The emperor coughed gently. Although Fan Rou had miraculous hands and had already taken out most of the metal shards and steel balls in his body, the destructive power of Chun Pingping's wheelchair had been too great. No one knew that his injuries were actually very serious. The Qing emperor was a great grandmaster, so he was able to survive. If it had been anyone else, they would probably have long died under Chun Pingping's twin spears. "Enji, your brother has some misunderstandings toward me. Once these misunderstandings are cleared up in the future, everything will be fine." For some reason, the emperor didn't seem to want to see the young lady of the Fan family worry, and went against his nature to explain this in a quiet voice. These were indeed the emperor's sincere words. In his opinion, Enji had always been a person who valued friendship. Chun Pingping's tragic death would inevitably make it difficult for him to understand and come around for a moment. In the future, if Fan Xian knew of the great evil Chun Pingping had done to the Li royal family, and how he had attacked Fan Xian so many times, Fan Xian would understand. "You are right, Your Majesty." Fan Rou lowered her head and agreed. The emperor's expression became somewhat dark. He didn't like the way the young lady of the Fan family spoke. After a long time, he didn't explode. He only slowly closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Enji has already slept for a day and night. It looks like he has had a hard journey." Fan Rou raised her head and gently bit her lower lip. Looking at the emperor in front of her, whom she could not see through no matter what, she didn't know how to respond. Her brother was currently sleeping on the bed in the manor. Presumably, he would not be sleeping well. What kind of emotion did the emperor's words represent? Tell me about when you first learned martial arts in Qing Mountain. I have never stepped foot into northern Qi territory. This has always been my regret. The emperor naturally changed the topic. For some reason, he really did go along with Fan Rou's wishes. He knew that if they talked about Jingdo and the Fan Manor, it would chill the young lady's heart. Of course, before long, I will be able to go to Qing Mountain and see for myself. The emperor smiled slightly. Fan Rou respectfully replied, "The scenery on Qing Mountain is very good. The brothers of Tianidao are also very good to me. You are, after all, a citizen of the Qing kingdom. Although I don't know what trick Fan Xian used to force Ku He, that bald man, to take you as his last disciple, presumably those northern Qi people still don't feel comfortable looking at you," the emperor carelessly said as he rubbed at the white hair at his temples. Fan Rou smiled naturally and said, "Your Majesty's eyes are like torches." At the time, the situation was indeed like that. However, later on, the teacher spoke. Additionally, Sister Haidang returned to the mountain. Naturally, things got better. Speaking of Haidang, how exactly was Enji and her dealt with? A glimmer of emotion flashed through the emperor's eyes as he calmly asked. Fan Rou could clearly sense that the emperor was not using this matter to ask about anything. Rather, he was curious about the story of a man and a woman that was being spread around by the people of the world. She looked in a daze at the emperor's slightly pale face. Suddenly, she thought that these things all had to do with her brother. Her brother would never discuss the details of these things with the emperor. Was this a conversation about family matters? Fan Rou suddenly understood. The emperor was just old, just lonely, just lonely. It was just that as a father, he had never received the treatment of father. So, he had her stay in the palace to talk to her more. He wanted to know more about the ordinary things in the world, and he wanted to know more about things related to her brother. The emperor and his young daughter's family conversation continued calmly and strangely. It was clear that the emperor's mood had improved. A rare warm expression began to appear on his pale face. The door to the royal study opened. Eunuch Yao led 2 young eunuchs in carrying a copper basin. Inside the basin was steaming hot water. The emperor accepted the hot towel from Eunuch Yao's hands and used his gaze to indicate for Fan Rou to continue talking. He then placed the rolling towel on his face and forcefully wiped his eyes a few times. Under the towel, the Qing emperor slowly closed his eyes. No one could see his expression. No one knew that in that moment, he had suddenly thought of how he had taken Li Chongping back to the palace after the autumn rain. Little San Er's hand, which he had held, had been trembling the entire time. His gaze as he looked at him was filled with fear. It was very much like Changqian many years ago. A cold anger suddenly surged in the emperor's heart. He tore off the towel from his face and threw it to the ground. After taking a few deep breaths, he suppressed his temper and looked at Eunuch Yao. What took so long? Eunuch Yao knelt down and replied in a trembling voice. The internal court had something important to report earlier, so I was delayed. Speak. The spies the internal court placed outside the Fan Manor. Speaking of this, Eunuch Yao glanced unconsciously at the young lady of the Fan Manor, who was staring at him in a daze. He then quickly lowered his head. A total of 14 people. They were all killed. The emperor's face suddenly became as heavy as ice. He slowly sat up straight on the bed and looked at Eunuch Yao without saying a word. Fan Ruo, who was sitting to the side, suddenly heard this news. Her face gradually paled. She could not get over it. These 2 days, she had been guarding the royal study by the emperor's side. She knew that her brother had returned to the capital and the manor. Although the internal court and military had, on the surface, relaxed their suppression of the Fan Manor, they still left countless spies outside the manor responsible for monitoring. Those spies were all dead? What was her brother thinking? Did he not know that the emperor had him sleep peacefully in the manor, waiting for him to wake up and enter the palace to ask for punishment? Yet he insisted on killing all of the people the emperor had sent out. Was he not afraid of angering the emperor? The frost on the emperor's face slowly melted. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. He smiled with a glimmer of mockery. Calmly, he said, "Continue to send people over. I have millions of people under heaven. Can he kill them all by himself?" The front doors of the Fan Manor were wide open. Lanterns hung high, illuminating half the street in the south of the city as clearly as if it was daytime. The Duke of Donbo was covered in blood. He walked out from the shadows that the lanterns could not reach. Under the terrified gazes of the people on the street wearing official robes and revealing their identities, he slowly walked to the front door of his home. He sat down on a long bench in front of the Fan Manor's front door and threw the blood-stained sword of the Wei Emperor at his feet. He extended his hand and rubbed it a few times in the basin of hot water a servant brought over. The clear water in the basin immediately turned into blood. Chapter 708. Fan Xian washed his hands seriously. He changed 3 basins of clear water before he was able to wash the blood off his hands. The servants pulled out the blood into the mud beside the stone lions in front of the Fan Manor's front door. No one knew if it would raise some vicious, resentful spirit. The clothes on his body were still covered in blood. He took them off without a care and changed into a fresh outer garment. The sleeves of his clothes fluttered slightly in the early autumn night wind. All of this dramatic scene was completed in front of the Fan Manor's front door. The Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had heard the news and rushed over, the head of the Ministry of Justice, and the internal court eunuchs who had rushed over from the palace all saw everything clearly. Fan Xian's hands, which were exposed outside his sleeves, were still trembling slightly. After all, he had used up too much energy for 6 or 7 days. It was not something that could be recovered with a single sleep. Additionally, under the cover of the night earlier, he had held the sword in his hand and reaped the lives of the people responsible for watching outside the manor like a demon. It was another great loss. It made his face slightly pale. His handsome and slightly pale face, paired with the sword on the ground and the stench of blood all around him, made Fan Xian appear particularly terrifying. He was the current director of the Overwatch Council. He was a killing god in the dark that the Overwatch Council had used 20 years to cultivate. However, people were always blinded by his identity, his title, his power, and his glory. No one would have thought that Fan Xian's most powerful aspect was his ability to kill. Of course, he had not killed all of the spies the palace had sent to watch the Fan Manor. Those who were able to escape before Fan Xian attacked or reveal their identities were only knocked to the ground by him. As for the spies who were particularly close to the Fan Manor, within the confines of an alley, and disguised as various commoners and merchants, they did not have any chance to negotiate or show weakness. They became a wisp of spirit on the edge of the sword in his hand. Waking from that nightmare, Fan Xian's eyes left the cold stimulation of the snowy mountain. The first thing he did was launch a counterattack. However, this counterattack was unavoidably overly bloody and unreasonable. Fan Xian was not a bloodthirsty person. He knew that the spies outside the Fan Manor were all people the Emperor and important officials in court had sent. These people did not understand Fan Xian's current state of mind, so he had to be on guard. However, he had to kill. After opening his eyes, his first accurate judgment was that the Emperor would certainly reduce his power and strictly control his connections with the Overwatch Council subordinates loyal to him. Although Yin Bingyun, with the help of the royal palace and the suppression of military power, controlled that square and sinister building in name, everyone knew that after Chun Pingping's tragic death in front of the royal palace, this sinister courtyard only had one master left, Fan Xian. As long as Fan Xian was able to re-establish countless ties with the Overwatch Council, then even the Emperor would not be able to stop Fan Xian from successfully gathering the power of the Overwatch Council. At least in the short term, the Emperor would not allow Fan Xian to have the Overwatch Council's help again. Yi Zhong had led troops to invite Fan Xian back to the capital and had planted so many spies outside the manor. It was clear that the Emperor wanted to temporarily put Fan Xian under house arrest in the manor. Fan Xian could not give the Emperor time to gradually make arrangements. Once Fan Xian lost contact with the Overwatch Council for too long, the court would gradually break down the internal composition of the Overwatch Council and invite out the officials loyal to Chen Pingping and Fan Xian one by one. Then they would desperately mix in sand, just like how the Imperial Censorate had mixed sand into the Overwatch Council 2 years ago. Before the Overwatch Council left his control, Fan Xian had to take the initiative layer by layer and prepare to have the power that belonged to him return to the darkness and calm, waiting for the time he needed them again. All of this was based on Fan Xian having to contact them, the most loyal Qinian unit. The spies outside the Fan Manor had to die. Fan Xian would not take the risk of carrying out such a dangerous task while someone was following him. Under the suppression of the Emperor's authority, the only way to make the surveillance outside the Fan Manor show a gap was the terror of blood and death. Other than this, there was no other way. Earlier, when a crow from the First Bureau had risked his life to deliver the news into the Fan Manor, it made Fan Xian's heart freeze and his hand that held the sword. 4 Overwatch Council officials had already been hanged in the prison. They were not the heads of the 8 bureaus. It looked like Yin Bingyun was still desperately trying to preserve the Overwatch Council's power. However, he was still unable to protect those 2 officials. Those 4 officials were the ones who had tried to forcefully take action and save the old director when Chun Pingping had been sent to the Overwatch Council's prison. The Emperor would certainly not allow officials who dared to go against his will to exist, so they died cleanly. For Fan Xian, this was a dangerous signal. It was a dangerous signal that the Emperor was beginning to purge the Overwatch Council. Thus, he also took action. He did not use any insignificant power or any subordinates he could use. He only personally stepped over the high threshold of the Fan Manor. Pulling out the cold, long sword behind him, he walked through the night and killed 14 people. Lanterns hung high in front of the Fan Manor door. Torches gathered in the long streets in the south of the city, illuminating it as if it were daytime. A few officials looked at the bloody bodies being carried out from the streets. They looked at each other and felt a chill in their hearts. Their faces were deathly pale. They didn't know what to say. They had always known that Sir Fan Jr. was a powerful figure who did not act according to common sense. However, they still did not understand why Sir Fan Jr. would risk the Emperor's anger and the danger of being captured and imprisoned to kill so many people in front of so many people. The officials all knew that the corpses piled up in the carriages were all capable spies sent by the palace and their own yamens. Their target was the little Duke of Fan Manor. No wonder he was so angry. Was the follow-up to his anger such a brutal killing? From the internal court to the Overwatch Council to the Ministry of Justice, all of the departments and yamens in the Qing court were probably used to sending out spies to find out the information they needed. The first two terrifying existences were even more so. No one knew how many spies they had planted in the manors of the various nobles and officials in Jingdo. The Overwatch Council was an old hand at doing this. It was rumored that the First Bureau had already reached the level of planting spies in the manors of every official in the capital above the 6th level. The matter of spies was not a secret in the officialdom of Jingdo. The officials were all used to this. Even if one day, due to some strange matter, they discovered that there were spies from the palace or the Overwatch Council in their manors, they could only foolishly pretend they didn't know. If they couldn't pretend anymore, they could only treat them well. Then they would verbally remind them and politely escort them out of the manors and back to their yamens. The officials knew that these spies represented the emperor's eyes and the might of the court. They had never thought that an official would be like Sir Fan Jr. and coldly and arrogantly kill all of these spies. The deputy assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice glanced at the embarrassed son Jingxiu and said in a low voice, "Sir Sun, you have to ask the little duke what happened today." Killing people on the street was already a violation of the death penalty in the Qing law. Even though Fan Xian was of high status and had entered the range of the 8 deliberations and could be exempted from the death penalty, it was still difficult to forgive him. Furthermore, the people he had killed were all secretly officials of the court. However, Fan Xian washed his blood-stained hands in the firelight and changed into blood-stained clothes in front of all the officials. His expression was cold and calm. Who dared to go forward and capture him? Among the officials, only the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, was in charge of this matter. Everyone knew that the Sun Manor had a close relationship with the Little Duke. A few months ago, the Little Duke had fought with Scholar He of the Hall of Governmental Affairs for the sake of Sun Jingxiu's future. He had fought until Scholar He's face was covered in dirt. Thus, the gazes of all the officials landed on Sun Jingxiu's face. Sun Jingxiu's heart was bitter. He knew what his colleagues were afraid of. However, these days were even more difficult for him. First, something major had happened to the Overwatch Council. In the end, Director Chun had been tragically killed by 1,000 cuts. That day, he had personally seen Sir Fan Jr. ride alone into the execution field. He had been so scared that his entire body had gone cold. He didn't know what kind of role Sir Fan Jr. would play in the court in the future. Would he sink into oblivion, or would he be severely punished by the emperor? If Fan Xian fell and lost power, Sun Jingxiu would not have a good end. Thus, he had been waiting in the Jingdo government in terror for the emperor's edict to remove his position. Unexpectedly, before the emperor's edict had arrived, his backer, Sir Fan Jr., had done such a shocking and treasonous thing. He walked with his body bent to the front door of the Fan Manor and bowed deeply to Fan Xian. He then quietly asked a few questions. Fan Xian was sitting tiredly on the long bench. The sword of the Wei Emperor had been thrown at his feet. Seeing Sun Jingxiu come forward, he was not surprised. With a cold expression, he replied. The officials were afraid and did not go forward. They didn't know what exactly the two of them were talking about, so they could only wait patiently. After Sun Jingxiu walked down the stone steps, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice furrowed his brows and said, "What did the Duke say? This is not a small matter. Killing someone on the street, even if it is made to Taichung Temple, there has to be an explanation." The assistant minister did not have the boldness to have the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice send people into the Fan Manor to capture people. However, the Qing laws were strict. Seeing this scene, these officials could not pretend they didn't see anything. No one knew what Fan Xian had said to Sun Jingxiu earlier, but the Jingdo magistrate no longer had much fear on his face. With a calm expression, he said, "The Duke said that Jingdo has not been peaceful recently. The Overwatch Council has found that some old women have come into the capital to kidnap children. As you know, there are 2 young masters in the Fan Manor, so Sir Fan Jr. is nervous." Earlier, after eating, he walked around the various streets and alleys outside the manor and saw some eye-catching people. At a glance, He knew they were not decent people, so he asked a few questions. Unexpectedly, those people were so daring to take out a weapon and attack the Duke. Of course, the Duke would not be polite to these scoundrels. After these words came out, the officials in the center sucked in a cold breath. They had seen shameless and ruthless nobles, but they had never seen such a shameless and ruthless noble. 14 lives had been taken just like that. He had also forcefully framed the other party as a suspect of the old woman. This was self-defense and seemed to make sense. However, to say that the little Duke of the Fan Manor had single-handedly gone to ask for the whereabouts of the old woman and ended up being hunted down by 14 people, no one would believe it no matter how they tried to explain it. Naturally, I do not believe it, but I also do not have any evidence. Of course, I can ask the Duke to return to the Yamen for questioning and to record an offering or something. However, it is already late at night. I'm not interested. Sun Jingxiu's back suddenly straightened. Gazing at his colleagues beside him, he coldly said, "Sir, the Yamen also has this kind of authority. If you are willing to take over this case, you can do as you please. However, I would like to remind everyone that the people who died were mostly people from the palace. The palace has not spoken, so it is best not to act rashly." This was a huge sentence of nonsense. Everyone knew who had died outside the Fan Manor. This was originally a matter between the Emperor and the Duke. Even if these officials were given a few guts, they would not dare to interfere. However, Fan Xian had gone too far. The matter was about to reach the palace. If these officials did not react first, who knew what the palace would think of them? After Sun Jingxiu said this, he left with the bailiffs of the Jingdo government. He could no longer be bothered with these matters. The simple conversation with Fan Xian earlier had put him at ease. Although the taste of the meatball was not very good, at least the Duke had said that as long as he did not die, the Sun Manor would be fine. Having said this much, Sun Jingxiu had nothing else to complain about. Everything was up to fate. Watching the people of the Jingdo government leave through the front door of the Fan Manor, Fan Xian rose from the long bench and glanced coldly at the officials below the stone steps. Picking up the Sword of the Wei Emperor, which everyone viewed as a treasure, from beside his feet, like picking up a mop with water on it, he casually slapped it a few times on the stone lion's head. This action was very much like a shameless and reckless brat. Yet, it was done by Sir Fan Jr. The strong contrast made the expressions of the officials change. Entering the manor, a serving girl had long since come forward to hand him a thick robe. Only then did Fan Xian feel his body warm a little. As he tightened his robe, he walked toward the back of the manor and casually asked, "Is the water for the reed roots ready? If it's ready, then quickly send it over." The serving girl made a sound of acknowledgement and went to the kitchen to keep an eye on it. Fan Xian walked alone to the back of the manor and sat by the bed. Facing his wife, Lin Wan who was sitting at the table, he quietly said, "I killed 14. Tomorrow, perhaps 28 will come. Actually, those are just subordinates of the court. They receive orders from the palace and various departments. Why bother?" A glimmer of pity appeared on Lin Wan-er's face. "Besides, even if you're unhappy and want to avenge the 2 Overwatch Council subordinates who died in prison, there's no need to vent your anger on those people. You don't understand. The Emperor wants to keep me under house arrest in this manner. He knows that unless he personally leaves the palace to keep an eye on me, even if Yizhong comes, it would be impossible to cut off my contact with the outside world." Fan Xian wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. He felt that his body was still weak. In a raspy voice, he said, "The Emperor has to attend to many affairs every day. How could he personally keep an eye on me? Thus, he can only cast a large net outside our manor. I have to rip apart this net. Otherwise, I will become a frog in a pot of warm water. When I die, I won't even know how I died." A chilling coldness rose between Fan Xian's brows. "But you also said that you killed 14 people today. Tomorrow, there could be 28. The Emperor is the master of Qin Kingdom. All the officials and people under heaven are tools in his hands. No matter what, it is impossible to kill them all." Lin Wanner looked at him with a worried expression. Killing too many will naturally cause people to be afraid, Fan Xian said with his head slightly lowered. Although imperial power is deeply rooted in the hearts of the people and cannot be resisted, the fear of death will presumably cause the spies and officials pulling the net to unconsciously reveal some openings. Hearing these words, the worry on Lin Wan Er's face did not fade. Her watery eyes were filled with concern and unease toward Fan Xian. In a quiet voice, she said, "If the Emperor wants to subdue you, there are many other ways." Fan Xian's hands rested on either side of his body. He lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then faintly said, "By keeping my sister in the palace, he is forcing me to not leave the capital. If he wants to subdue me, he must lock me up in the royal palace by his side. I don't think the Emperor will take this risk." Speaking of this, he raised his head and looked at his wife's worried face. Warmly, he said, "Shunning and Liangzi have already left the city. You've done very well in this matter. Otherwise, as parents, we would not be able to do as we please in the capital." Cici and the others should have already reached the manor, but I think there will certainly be news from the palace. Lin Wan Er sighed and walked to his side. Gently, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "I don't care what you want to do. You have to think my sister is still in the palace, and the two little ones haven't gone far. That's why I need to get in touch with my people." Fan Xian tenderly and gently stroked his wife's slightly thin face. Cici is usually unremarkable, but she is actually a very assertive person who can endure hardship. Tung Zijing is experienced in handling matters. Presumably, he won't let the palace catch the tail. If I can get in touch with the people in the Qinian unit, I will have a way to send them back to Danzhou. As for my sister still in the palace, she should be fine. Fan Xian's voice suddenly became cold. "I am directly challenging the Emperor's authority because I want to see just how far he wants to go. Are you really not afraid that Uncle the Emperor will punish you severely?" Lin Wan sat up straight and looked at him worriedly. She knew very well how cold-blooded and heartless the relative sitting on the throne was. Once he discovered that Fan Xian was no longer the illegitimate child he could control, what kind of response would he make? Lin Wan always thought that Fan Xian's present actions appeared overly aggressive and risky. Any of the Emperor's actions have nothing to do with family or feelings. They only have to do with profit, Fan Xian said with his eyes closed. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "If we acknowledge this benchmark, we can try to analyze it. Perhaps the Emperor will be angry, but he will not force me into a desperate situation. Regardless of whether it is the children I plan to send to Danzhou, Ruo in the palace, or you." Fan Xian opened his eyes and looked at his wife. Slowly, he said, "These are all my bottom lines. If the Emperor breaks this bottom line, then he can only force us to completely turn against him early." Lin Wan looked at him with some confusion. Fan Xian said, "I never underestimate any of my enemies, but I also never underestimate myself. Regardless of whether the Emperor forces me to rebel or kills me, it will only bring him, the Qin court, consequences that he will find difficult to bear and a chaotic situation that will be difficult to clean up. If I die, what will happen to Dongyi? Will Sigu Jian's disciples and grand disciples still abide by that unwritten agreement? Although the court has mixed in the 10,000 elite soldiers in the Great Prince's hands, the movements of the Imperial Army 3 years ago have already shown our brother's ability to control troops. He can completely control this powerful army in a short amount of time. If Chun Pingping dies, and I die as well, brother will certainly not listen to me. Even if he doesn't lead the army back to Jingdou, he will at least stay in Dongyi and watch coldly over father in Jingdou. It will be best if the Emperor doesn't use Aunt Ning to threaten him. From your description, after the incident in the royal study, Aunt Ning already has the will to die. Given her valiant and hot-blooded personality, if the Emperor uses her life to threaten brother to return to the capital, she will probably immediately die in front of the Emperor. Yin Zhilan is also not an idiot. If I die, he will certainly be able to guess my brother's thoughts. With such a powerful ally for no reason, he will certainly do his best to assist and maintain Dongyi's independent position. If I die, what kind of reaction will Hongsheng, who is still in Dingzhou, have? If I die, what kind of upheaval will happen to Jiangnan that I have managed for 5 years? Even if Xia Qifei betrays me, I still have enough ways to throw all of Jiangnan into chaos. Not to mention the Overwatch Council. Presently, the Overwatch Council is maintaining its silence. One reason is the army outside the council. The more important reason is that all of the officials are watching me in secret. They want to know what I want to do. If I also die, the Overwatch Council will fall apart. Look, if the Emperor truly forces me to rebel or directly kills me on the spot, it will bring so much upheaval. A strange smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Faintly, he said, How could he bear to? How could he dare? In reality, Fan Xian still had a lot of bargaining chips hidden behind his back that he had not spoken of. There was no need. Secondly, he himself did not have much confidence in the bargaining chips in the north. However, up to this point, the last 4 words he coldly spoke were just that resolute and full of confidence. Inheriting his mother's legacy, the care of countless elders, the emperor's favor and trust over these years, and the support of those strange old creatures, whether openly or secretly, Fan Xian finally lived up to everyone's expectations and became the only major figure in this world who could face the powerful emperor of the Qin kingdom and not have to retreat. Perhaps no one noticed this usually. Once people focused their gazes here, they would be shocked to discover that the storms in the Qin kingdom and the world these years had created such an abnormal existence as Fan Xian. I think you still underestimate the emperor, Lin Wan said quietly after a long silence. Lin Wanner was silent for a long time. She then quietly said, Perhaps for the sake of the Qin kingdom, for the sake of the world, he will tolerate your great disrespect. But this is not just because he is afraid of the things you can influence. It includes many other things, perhaps some subtle things. Once he discovers that you truly do not have any affection for him, he will directly erase you. The best way to destroy a person is to destroy his physical body. Lin Wanner looked at Fan Xian in a daze. Do you think that if the emperor could bear to kill you, he would care about Dongyi returning and rebelling? Would he care about Li Hongqing's little power in Dingzhou? Would he care about how much hunger and pain the people of Jiangnan will suffer? If he could bear to kill you, how could he care about anything else in the world? Even if the entire world has turned its back on the emperor, he still has the courage and power to fight his way out. Furthermore, you can, at most, add a few hard-to-repair scars to his world. Lin Wanner gently stroked his haggard and pale face and sighed. Don't think for me. Don't think for the child. No matter what you do, think more about yourself. Fan Xian was silent. He had to admit that although he had the deepest understanding of the emperor in this world, his wife, who had grown up at the emperor's knee, had a better grasp of emotions, thoughts, and habits. Let's not talk about this. When the reed root soup arrives, you have to drink it while it's hot. Fan Xian forced a smile. These years, Wanner's illness had been very stable. Other than Sir Fei and Fan Xian's medicine, the biggest contributor was the soup made from the reed roots of the North Sea. As the words left his mouth, Fan Xian suddenly thought of the North Sea. He thought of the reed leaves that pricked a person's skin. He thought of the woman he hadn't seen in a long time and hadn't thought of in a long time. He wondered if she was doing well in Shihu. The reason he suddenly thought of Haidang Duo was because after the conversation earlier, Fan Xian had more clearly determined what he should do. Wana was right. The best way to destroy a person was to destroy his physical body. Fan Xian closed his eyes in silence, thinking about how to melt the snowy mountain that had not melted in 10,000 years. How could he defeat a great grandmaster? Haitang? Or 13th Wang? Or himself? Or was it that no one in this world could do it? Fan Xian began to miss Uncle Wu Zhu, but it was not because he missed the metal drill by his side. Rather, it was because when his state of mind darkened, he unconsciously missed his closest family. The next day, the front doors of the Fan Manor opened wide. The spies sent by the internal court once again filled the dark corners of this street in the south of the city. It looked like the emperor in the palace knew what his illegitimate son was thinking and testing. He only sat calmly in the royal study and met the myriad changes by remaining unchanging. He wasted away Fan Xian's time and gradually raised the temperature of the water in the pot. The large piece of firewood shoved under the pot was the emperor's edict that eunuch Dai had sent in the morning. Hearing the familiar Yu Yao's accent, Fan Xian knelt in the main hall in his black official robes. A calm light of everything being within his expectations flashed through his eyes. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.